A Light on the Mail Order, Bride's Love.
Written by Rita Wethers and published by Starfall Publications. All formats available on our website. Enjoy.
Prologue. 1880 Montana. Honora, are we going to be happy here? The sadly spoken words brought tears to Honora Carter's eyes as the train drew to a stop in front of the station. She quickly blinked them away and turned in the seat. Honora looked at the petite, blonde-haired girl whose eyes were the color of the sea and forced a smile on her lips. "I reckon that we will," she replied, with as much enthusiasm as she could muster. Sheltering little Kate against the harsh realities they were going to face would have to be Honora's lifelong mission. Finding out that their circumstances had gone from bad to worse would shatter the 18-year-old girl. Having lost their father and brother during the train ride from Nebraska to Montana during this harsh winter was enough to scar Kate for life. For a moment, the memory of how she lost the men in her family during a raid flashed through her mind. The outlaws hadn't been merciful in shooting dead everyone that stood in their way. They had no remorse in gunning down women and children. "Hide!" Kate's father had shouted and pushed her and her sister into a pile of grain sacks close to the edge of the train. "Papa!" Kate had called with tears in her throat. Honora had quickly clasped a hand across her sister's mouth to prevent her from calling their father again. From her position in the pile of grains, Honora had been able to shift her body in such a way that she could stick her head out without being seen. With horror widening her eyes, she had seen her father dash in front of a woman holding a baby. One of the robbers had held a gun to the woman's head because she had nothing to offer them. "Have you no shame? Have mercy on her and her child," her father had shouted, veins standing out on his neck. The robber hadn't said a word, just calmly shot her father in the chest. Honora had clasped her other hand across her mouth to keep from screaming. The wicked man had thrown back his head, and mocking laughter had erupted from his throat. Honora would never forget the sound. Neither would she forget his voice and the scarred hand that killed her father. "Can't say anything now, can you, old man?" he had jeered while the life seeped out of her father. "No!" Papa, her brother, Stephen, had shouted and rushed from the other side of the train. He, too, had been providing comfort to a frightened old woman who was shivering badly. Honora had watched with devastation as her brother was also shot in the back by one of the outlaws. He dropped to the ground just beside their father. With tears in her eyes, she had watched the robbers go through the luggage and pockets of the travelers, methodically and without remorse. Fortunately for her and Kate, news of the sheriff and his deputies in Wyoming had stopped the bandits from coming towards them. The outlaws had taken to their heels only minutes before the lawmen arrived. Honora had rushed out of her hiding place to run to her father and brother, who were lying in a pool of blood. They were dead by the time she reached them, and all she could do was weep. Being 20 years of age, she hadn't thought that she would lose her father and brother so soon. She'd already lost her mother when the poor woman struggled to give birth to Kate. Devastated, she and Kate and the other survivors were taken to an inn to spend the night. Another train came the following day to take them to their destination, Montana. Her father had always seen his brother as family, no matter what he heard concerning his dealings. His children, however, had reservations about their uncle. Left to Honora, she would have preferred returning to Nebraska, but it was too late. They had sold all they had there to make the journey further west. Honora took her sister's hand and squeezed it. "We will be just fine, Kate. Don't you worry. As long as we have each other, we will be okay." With slow steps, they alighted from the train onto the platform that was teeming with people, mostly men. She could count the number of women there. It sent a sense of foreboding through her. Honora's gray eyes searched the train station for the man who was to be their sole guardian, Uncle Mervyn. He was their father's brother, though they had never particularly liked him. A small gasp fell from her lips when her eyes fell on a tall, masculine man with a pale face, regarding her with an expression akin to amusement. She noted that 3 men flanked him as he moved. As he drew closer, fear snaked up Honora's spine. Her hand rose to pull a strand of her dark brown hair back from her forehead. She had tied the curly, waist-length tresses with a strap, but it was beginning to fall apart. A nervous tongue ran across her full lips. When he reached them, Uncle Mervyn stared at her with bright blue eyes as if trying to see into her soul. He removed his hat and offered her a small smile. She noted that his gray and white hair had grown longer. He now left the straight hair falling around his ears. His beard was long, but properly groomed. Although he looked older than when she last saw him years ago, he still had the evil glint in his eyes. He was still tall and muscularly built with a slight hump. Honora acknowledged that she would just have to be strong for Kate's sake. Her sister must be kept safe and happy at all costs. Unconsciously, she took Kate's hand and gripped it hard, knowing that their lives had changed right there. Chapter 1. 1881, California. Father, for the 5th time, that is not who I am or represent. It is good you found happiness in ranching and agricultural life, but I am an engineer. Taylor Brooks ran an impatient hand through his tousled black hair. Sometimes his father had him so exasperated, all he wanted to do was scream. Why couldn't the man just accept that he wasn't into ranching like him? He had never despised his father's choice of being a rancher. Why couldn't the man see that not everyone must go down that path? "Engineer," his father bellowed, his blue eyes almost popping out of their sockets. "This is what people would hear you say, and they wouldn't hire you to work for them. These are the ideas of a madman." Madman? Surely that was going too far. Granted, his ideas were radical. He had to admit that, but he believed in a bright future ahead. Life was not simply to get by, not simply harvesting metals and minerals, but harvesting electricity. That was the future, and the future would move past mining and herding sooner rather than later. Tired of arguing because his father would never understand his beliefs, Taylor simply walked out of the large sitting room. His black polished shoes sounded heavy on the wooden floor as he walked down the hallway. Brushing away specks from his waistcoat and tweed coat, he left the house and walked towards the gate. Taylor grimaced when he saw a spot of dust on his black trousers. He removed his handkerchief from his coat pocket and wiped it off. He hated looking anything other than orderly. His father repeatedly told him that he dressed like a dandy. This had elicited laughter from him several times. His father didn't understand that being garbed in a shirt, waistcoat, coat, and trousers didn't mean that he dressed like a popinjay. He always had to look the part of the businessman that he was. His father was always clad like the rancher that he was, mainly in dungarees. While Taylor had no problem with that, he couldn't be attired that way. After all, he wasn't a rancher, and he didn't think that he would ever be. At the gate, he turned and looked at the wide expanse of land with its lush vegetation and the backdrop of mountains towering over it like a shelter. Buildings consisting of the red brick ranch house, bunkhouses, a stable, and a barn covered one part of the land. An orchard with several fruit trees lined the other part of the ranch. Taylor walked down the road to take a stagecoach to San Jose, where he worked. He had come to tell his father how things were going well with his plan to transmit electricity in the town. He should have saved his breath. His father was more interested in asking him when he would start participating fully in ranch activities. When he was growing up, he had been forced to take an interest in ranch work, but he had known at a young age that ranching wasn't for him. If only Papa would accept that. Taylor was in the middle of a big deal with the lighting of the Moonlight Tower in San Jose. He believed that his innovative plan for electrical transmissions would change his life and society as well. Unfortunately, his father didn't realize that should he achieve his plan, he would make a lot of money. The streets were laden with wagons carrying people and goods all over the place. Men were dressed like him, while others who were just coming in from mining camps at the outskirts of the city looked very unkempt. Women and children also moved about the various buildings consisting of grocery shops, saloons, bars, and an inn. He went to the livery and paid the stable lad for his horse he had taken there that morning. The lad brought out the black stallion, and Taylor swiftly mounted it. Although he liked the hustle and bustle San Jose offered, he preferred living in the quiet town a short distance away. Taylor tipped his hat at the people he met along the way. He smiled at the women who batted their eyelashes at him. It wasn't an unusual occurrence for women to be that forward with him. Wherever he went, women sought him out. He believed that it was because he was somewhat different from the menfolk around there. Most of the men in Carson were either miners, ranchers, or store owners. To them, Taylor stood out. Taylor tried to be as polite to them as possible. He declined their bold offers. Most of them backed away when they saw he wasn't interested. But not all. Taylor returned to thinking about his dream, which would give him a sense of completion and meaning if achieved. Maybe then his father wouldn't see his 36 years of existence as a waste, which he believed to be so now. He was just about to leave the place to head home when he bumped into someone. Whoa! A grimace, which he hid by running his hand across his clean-shaven chin, turned Taylor's lips. Of all the people to come across in town that day, Roger Tate was the worst. "Who do we have here?" "Taylor Brooks," the man announced in that booming voice of his. "Mr. Tate," Taylor returned with a small smile on his face. He was beginning to wonder if the miner was following him around. Everywhere he turned, he always bumped into Roger, and the man never failed to put his proposal forward. "If I had known that I was going to bump into you today, I would have come along with Isabella." Taylor regarded with amusement the tall, robust man with a thick mustache. Roger removed his brown hat and ran his hand through his thinning brown hair. "Have you given any thought to my proposal?" the man questioned as usual. "If you marry my daughter, I'm ready to finance this electricity dream of yours. I might not know much about it, but I know that my daughter wants you." Taylor had no doubt that Roger would be able to fund his plan. The man was a wealthy rancher who owned an estate and employed a lot of workers. Isabella, Roger's daughter, was a fine woman with straight blonde, shoulder-length hair and blue eyes. She was always well-dressed to cover her tall and slim frame. Although her complexion was very pale from not coming out in the sun to do any work, she was nonetheless beautiful, but she was too spoiled and very traditional. She wanted what she'd grown to want. After just a few minutes spent in her company, he had come to the realization that she had no aspirations. Unfortunately for him, Isabella had taken one look at him and decided she wanted him. And because her father gave her whatever she wanted, the man had been trying to pressure him into marrying his daughter. What both father and daughter didn't understand was that he wasn't in a hurry to marry. When he did, he wanted it to be to someone else, somebody passionate about something, just like him. A woman who was very different from Isabella, who would share his dream and not fall asleep while he was trying to tell her about it. Then it hit him. He could find such a woman if he placed an advert in the newspaper. He had heard of mail-order brides, but he never thought that he would have to resort to ordering one. But desperate times call for desperate measures, don't they? Belatedly realizing that Roger was waiting for an answer, Taylor offered the rancher a small smile. "Thanks for the offer, Mr. Roger, but I have to say no. Again, please excuse me." He brushed past the man and hastily rode away from him. "Think about it, Taylor," Roger called after him. "You won't regret it, I promise." Taylor didn't bother replying to him. He rode back to the city, to the office of the Matrimonial Times. Taylor reached the office and penned down what he desired in a wife. Not that he really needed one. Getting the women in the place, particularly Isabella, to leave him alone was his sole aim. He placed the advert in the hope that the right kind of woman would enjoy such a lifestyle. Maybe the woman who would respond might understand his views. He could only hope. Chapter 2. Letting out a deep sigh, Honora placed the file in the cupboard and slammed it shut. She turned around in the small office she had worked in for the past year and nearly screamed. She couldn't take it anymore. Ever since her uncle had placed her in the tiny office that could barely hold a table, a chair, and a cabinet, she'd been trying to find a way to escape it all. She looked outside the office's small window. Watching how the miners suffered day in and day out was becoming too much for her to bear. The poor men were underpaid and starved, yet her uncle expected them to work practically 24 hours a day. She recalled with a frown the time she'd been so moved watching the rake-thin men hard at work under the Montana sun, she had offered them some water and her food. Her uncle had bellowed at her at such times to stop and get on with her own work. "If you pity them so much, maybe you should join them," he had warned with a malicious glint in his eyes. Honora wouldn't put it past him to send her into the mines to labor all day in search of gold beyond the river. He was that cruel. Growing up, they had always known him to be a mean person. But for the last 12 months of living and working with him, Honora had come to see how wicked he was. Seeing the men hunched over, shaking their panning tools, hoping that gold was among the stones, tore at her heart. Even when it rained and snowed, her uncle hadn't shown them mercy. When the men decided that they couldn't take it anymore, Uncle Mervyn found one reason or another not to pay them. Some of the men had ended up giving up the ghost. Honora left the stifling office, which was located a short distance from the mines. She turned her gaze from the men who were covered in dirt. Old Jeb was coughing badly, and the sound broke her heart. The man had complained of chest pains the previous day. Honora had wanted to take him to the doctor, but Uncle Mervyn would hear nothing of it. He had threatened to dock the man's pay if he dared leave to see the doctor. The man had begged her to leave him there. He had 6 mouths to feed. If he didn't bring home any money that day, his family would starve. Her uncle was talking to some men outside the mines when she approached them. The men turned around when she reached them. The cold eyes of one of the men scrutinized her, leaving Honora feeling as if there was mud on her brown calico dress and her brown bonnet. "Uncle Mervyn, I'm going for my lunch break," she stiltedly told him. Without replying, he simply waved his hand. Glad to be away from the eyes of the short, fat man, Honora hurried away. Walking home for her lunch break every day was one of the things she hated doing. All eyes were always on her. She hated the town, called Raven, with a passion. Raven's population was sparse and mainly dominated by men. Every time she walked down the road to the house she shared with her uncle, or to Kate's house, they would come out and stare as if they were stripping the skin off her bones. Drunken men would stand in front of the saloon and whistle at her while she passed or make lewd remarks. Honora couldn't believe that this was the sort of town that her father had hoped to settle in. It didn't boast much. Sure, it had its own grocery stores, saloons, a haberdashery at its outskirts, a small inn. But there weren't buildings to cater to the needs of the few women who resided in the small town. What most of the shops sold were things that accommodated miners who kept trooping into the town almost on a daily basis. Most often, one would see shops with mining supplies rather than ones with dresses. Thank goodness her mother had taught her and Kate how to sew, so they were able to make their own dresses from the few materials they had brought with them. Honora felt so self-conscious in her simple dress. She hastened her steps, forcing her booted feet to move fast. She reached Kate's house and hurried inside, slamming the door behind her. The aroma of food led her to the kitchen, where she saw her sister washing plates. She heaved out a sigh of regret as she watched Kate. 6 months ago, her uncle had succeeded in cajoling Kate into marrying a powerful man, also in the gold mining business. Poor Kate had bought her uncle's words, stating that it was normal for a lady to live such a boring life. Honora had done her best trying to talk Kate out of marrying the man, but her sister, gullible and not seeing any other form of recourse, had refused to listen to her. "What else can I do, Honora?" Kate had asked, with tears pouring down her face. "This is it for us. There's no other path for us to follow. I'm not headstrong like you. I've decided to accept my fate. You will find yourself more at peace if you do too." Honora had ranted and raved, and even resorted to begging her uncle to have a change of heart. But the man had given her that cruel smile of his and said, "Be grateful that you're doing a wonderful job at the office, but make no mistake about it. The moment I find a replacement for you or the right man comes along, you will be wed." "Over my dead body!" she had yelled, before running out of the house to cry in the arms of the only friend she had made. Irene Woods had held her while she cried and lamented the loss of her father, who had wanted more for them. "Don't just stand there, Honora. Sit, let's eat. I made chicken broth. It's Jonas's favorite." Kate's voice suddenly pulled Honora out of her thoughts. "I didn't come here to eat, Kate," Honora told her as she walked over to the counter where her sister was putting away the crockery. "Aren't you tired of this kind of life?" Honora asked Kate, even though she knew that her sister was comfortable with the kind of life that she was living. Kate hated confrontations. She preferred to remain meek and docile, aspiring for nothing more, but Honora couldn't allow her to go on living like that. It was wrong. Kate shrugged. "What's wrong with this kind of life, as you put it?" she queried softly, drying the plates with a dish towel. "You prefer to cook and clean all day." Kate shrugged again without saying a word. Honora gritted her teeth. "Kate, times are changing. Women don't do domestic chores all day anymore. They're no longer just seen. They're now being heard. Aren't you tired of this prison?" She waved her hand, indicating the house. "Women are no longer passive. We can't afford to be through time and history." Kate shook her head. "Honora, I thought by now you would have given up on this madness. You're 21, for crying out loud. Shouldn't you be thinking of getting married? Although I don't know any man out there who would want to marry such a spirited woman like you," Kate giggled. Seeing that her words were falling on deaf ears, Honora said, "I'll see you tomorrow, Kate. Think about what I said." Honora ignored her sister's calls and hurried out of the house. Out in the street again and in the hot summer air, she continued her journey down the road to the house she lived in with her uncle. Honora was just about to open the door when she heard her name. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips when her gaze fell on the petite lady with long blonde hair that rested across her shoulders. Irene Woods was the only friend she had made since she came to Raven a year ago. All her sisters were married, and her father wanted her to marry a rancher. But Irene had other plans. Being a rancher's wife who cooked, cleaned, and bore children wasn't the way she wanted to live her life. Irene hated conforming to what had been done before. That was one of the reasons that she and Honora got on very well. They both believed that women should be heard now, not only seen. "Are you all right? You look miffed," Irene said as she came forward. Honora let out a heavy sigh. Irene joined her in front of the house. "It's Kate," Honora replied with a tinge of exasperation. "She's so visionless." Irene smiled. "Honora, surely you realize that she isn't like you." "I know, Irene, but she seems to have forgotten why we left Nebraska in the first place." Honora explained to Irene how her uncle was supposed to help her late father set up a business near the gold mine he owned, but her uncle ended up taking advantage of her and her sister, as he was their only living next of kin. "He took my father's bag that he gave me for safekeeping before we hid during the raid. He was going to use it to start his new business." Honora blinked back the tears that stung her eyes. Every time she thought of her father and her brother and how they were taken away from her, despair filled her. She missed them terribly. "It gives me great concern that Kate has forgotten all that and wants to become a housewife for the rest of her life. She has forgotten that our father wanted more for us," Honora complained bitterly. Irene put an arm around her. "I understand your concern, Honora, but I don't think you can do anything about it. Maybe if she sees you moving on, she might have a change of heart." A smile spread across Honora's face. This was the reason Irene was her friend. They shared the same views about life despite the odds against them. They felt equally trapped by their predestined fates. They dreamed of a different life, a free life, where they could express themselves. Honora and Irene continued to talk about the possibility of leaving the dreary town for a better life out there. Honora later went back to the office. It was while she was passing by the newspaper office that an idea crossed her mind. She'd heard of ads for men seeking mail-order brides from different parts of the country. If she could get one of the men to offer for her, she would be out of Raven in an instant. She walked to Irene's house and asked her about her father's newspaper. Irene asked, "What do you need it for?" "I need to read the ads section." Then, looking about her to make sure no one was within earshot, she said, "I have an idea on how to get away from here." Irene's brown eyes lit up with excitement. "Please tell me." "Mail-order bride." Irene's forehead scrunched into a frown. "Mail-order bride?" "Yes, that's the only way I can think of getting out of here. I want to go through the ads and find the one that is suitable for me. I'll reply to the man and hope he offers for me," she carefully explained to her friend, who was gawking at her wide-eyed. "That's brilliant," Irene said. "I'm going to state it here and now that I'm coming with you." Honora stared at her friend with shock. "You are?" Irene giggled. "I sure am. Do you think that I'd want to stay here when you're gone? Why, I'll be doggone bored. Besides, I see the idea as a great opportunity to make my dreams come true." Honora bobbed her head with enthusiasm. Having Irene come with her was splendid. Before Irene could go into the house to fetch her father's newspaper, Honora saw her uncle coming from the distance, so they postponed the search till the following day. Honora did her chores perfunctorily, waiting for the following day to come. Even at the office the next morning, she rushed all the work she had to do and waited patiently for her lunch break. She practically ran out of the office when it was time for her to go home. Irene was already waiting with the newspaper. She showed her several ads she had seen, and Honora picked one. "I think that's just the right ad," she said. 36-year-old man from San Jose, California, seeking a woman who wouldn't mind being married to an engineer with radical ideas. All I can offer for now is small comforts, but the possibility of riches is in the wings. Chapter 3. Whistling like a man who had won it all, Taylor let himself into his house with a bright smile on his face. He walked straight into the room that served as his sitting room and placed his bag on the table. The room could only hold a table and chair, but he wasn't bothered. He would get a proper and bigger house when he was to wed. That the possibility of that happening was within sight sent joy running through his body. Although he had expected to get a response from his ad, he hadn't thought that it would be this soon. To be told by the postmaster as he passed by the post office that he had a letter was one of the most exciting things that had happened to him lately. He had almost danced with joy at the wonderful piece of news. Taylor quickly pulled out the chair and settled himself on it. He swiftly opened his bag and brought out the letter. For a moment, he wondered if it wouldn't be better if he removed his coat so he would be comfortable in the heat. And what about a cup of coffee? Afraid that he might spill coffee on the letter and make it unreadable, he instead removed his coat and positioned it on the back of the chair. There was enough light filtering from the window, but Taylor wondered if he should light a candle just so he wouldn't miss a single word in the letter. Taylor stopped and chuckled at himself. He had to laugh at how outrageous he was behaving and sat down again. He was tempted to place the letter against his nose, but he quickly surmised that the woman's scent would be gone from numerous handlings of the paper. It was already marked with dirt on the edges. Carefully, he tore open the envelope and, unable to resist it, placed his nose on the letter. He caught the faint smell of lavender and smiled. Gently, he unfolded the piece of paper. Legible handwriting stared back at him, and he smiled. He had been half afraid that he might not be able to read it if the woman had handwriting like a chicken's scrawl. "Dear Mr. Taylor, this letter is in response to your ad in the newspaper for a mail-order bride. I'm Honora Carter, and I'm interested in becoming your mail-order bride if we find that we're well-suited. I'm 21 years old. I live with my uncle in Raven, Montana. My uncle owns a gold mine, and I work in his office. I'm interested in reading the radical views you claim to have. I enjoy reading books of all sorts. I beg to stop my letter here in order for me not to start rambling, not that I partake of it often. Please write to me if you're interested in further correspondence. Honora." Taylor put down the letter and then raised it again. He read it 3 more times with the same smile on his face. If he didn't receive any more letters, this woman would do. She not only sounded very educated, but he felt that she could be a good companion to him throughout the life he was venturing to have. For the reason that she was willing to read about his views, he secretly wished that he wouldn't get any other response. Taylor was happy to receive a reply to the ad. The woman sounded like one who could be a good companion throughout the life he was venturing to have. He couldn't be sure until he continued to exchange correspondence with her. Something told him it would be best to wait for replies from other women so that he would be able to respond to all of them at once. He shook his head. What if he didn't get any more letters? Then there was the fear that this woman had replied to other ads as well. If he tarried, someone else might respond to her quicker. What if hers was the only reply he got? He would have lost her waiting for others that weren't forthcoming. A bird in hand is worth two in the bush. Thankful that he had bought writing materials, he removed them from his bag. He waited for some minutes, composing the letter in his mind before he dipped his pen in ink and started scribbling on the paper. After 5 torn papers and spilled ink, he believed he had penned the right words to encourage her to write back to him. Satisfied, he rose and went back into the town to post the letter with the hope that she would reply. Over the course of the next month, Taylor exchanged correspondence with the woman, and they got to know each other better. He shared her views that women were created to do more than just domestic chores, and that times were changing. Taylor bought the idea because he believed that if he married Honora, she wouldn't be bored with his explanation concerning his dream. Honora would be sure to listen to him and probably give him ideas on how to go about it. He had caught Isabella yawning the first time he attempted to tell her what he had in mind about electricity. Her father had listened with a glint in his eyes. But since he wouldn't be wed to the man, Taylor had swiftly decided that Isabella wasn't the woman for him. One morning, as he strode down the street, having dodged Roger, he decided that he would offer for Honora. She had almost all the attributes he desired in a woman. There was no point stalling about it. Besides, it was imperative that he hastened his plans toward her. Roger was beginning to get more and more insistent, so when he returned home that day, he wrote to Honora to come to California. Chapter 4. Irene! Irene! Honora ran to the backyard where her friend was placing clothes on the line to dry. Honora! Irene's eyes became as huge as saucers when she noted her friend's flushed face. What is it? Irene asked with anxiety. Taylor has offered for me, Honora whispered fiercely to her friend, trying to contain her excitement.
Thank you for watching. Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
The long johns she was holding fell from Irene's hand. She clasped her friend's hands, and together they jumped around in a circle, their faces flushed with joy. That's wonderful, Irene replied in a low tone. Looking around her, she added, When do you leave? Honora's joy dimmed a little. Not any time soon. There's a problem. Irene's face fell. Oh, what is it? Letting out a long sigh, Honora answered, He wants me to come to California. Irene frowned. So? Honora shook her head. Can't you see that I can't go? She turned away. I don't want to experience what I did the last time I was inside a train. I'd feel unsafe, as if another raid would take place. Irene nodded. I understand. It's not a problem at all. Honora whirled around. It isn't. Irene shook her head. Tell him to come to you. Honora's lips parted. Do you think he'd agree to do that? Her friend smiled and resumed placing the clothes on the line. Honora joined her. But of course, Irene stated firmly, if he wants you for a bride, he must prove it by coming to fetch you. Honora chewed on her bottom lip with indecision in her eyes. Are you sure? Do you really think he'd do that? Irene nodded. But what if he decides it's too much trouble and finds himself another woman? Irene smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. Honora, I don't think he would have offered for you if he wasn't serious about it. Honora still looked doubtful about the success of her plans. Why don't you write to him and make the suggestion? If he doesn't agree to come, we'll have to find a way around it. Honora placed a dress on the line and paused. It's not just that, Irene. I'm also wondering how wise it is to go all the way to California to meet a complete stranger. Aren't you in the least skeptical about our journey? Then she released a huge gasp. You're still coming with me, aren't you? A smile spread across Irene's face. Just you try and stop me. Honora's breath came out in a huge sigh of relief. Thank goodness. And to answer your question, of course, I'm a little unsure about leaving the only home I've ever known. But when I look at what lies in store for me if I don't leave, I put aside my misgivings and think of only positive things. I see this as an opportunity to break free from the norm. I thought you saw it that way too. I saw it that way as well, but now that it's finally going to happen, I believe that I'm having cold feet about it, she explained quietly to her friend. Everything will be fine, Honora. I must go and write to Taylor to inform him of the change in plans. I do so hope that he's interested enough to come and fetch us. We've got to make plans if he agrees to come. Irene nodded. I have some of my PIN money saved. I'll have to pinch from the money Papa gives me to buy groceries. Tears suddenly welled up in Honora's eyes. I don't have any money. You know, my uncle has refused to pay me for my services in the office. When I broached the topic one day, he told me he was saving it as a wedding gift. She gritted her teeth. I know he's aware that if I gather enough money, I will escape. Hence, his reason for not paying me. You don't have to worry about money, Honora. Honora gripped her friend's hands with gratitude. Thank you, Irene. You don't have to thank me, Honora. I should be the grateful one. I was almost dying of boredom before you came. And now, thanks to you, I have the opportunity of leaving Raven and finding a life for myself. Honora smiled. It's my pleasure. You're doing me a favor as well. They were making plans for how Irene would help her post the letter as she usually did when Honora heard her uncle calling her. A little grimace crossed her face as she bid her friend goodbye and took slow steps back to the house. Uncle Mervyn stood by the kitchen door, staring at her with stern eyes. Where have you been? He questioned sharply. Honora looked down at her gray homespun dress. She bit her tongue to keep from saying what exactly was on her mind, which was telling him that it was none of his business. I was with Irene, she informed him, with her head lowered. He strode forward and jerked her by the arm painfully. Honora's eyes darted to his cold ones. How many times have I told you never to leave the house and go gossiping with the neighbor? Too many times that I can count. But since Irene was part of her plan to leave her uncle and his cruelty behind, she would continue sneaking over there. Get inside. Someone is waiting to meet you, her uncle said, pushing her roughly toward the kitchen door. Curious now, Honora tilted her chin and walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the sitting room. She paused for a moment to stare at the man who was seated on one of the green brocade chairs. Get in, Uncle Mervyn said curtly, nudging her. When she reluctantly walked into the living room, she recognized the short, fat man as one of her uncle's friends she had seen a couple of times at the mine. Up close, he looked even older than she thought, with a thin mustache lining the top of his lip and cold gray eyes. Don't just stand there looking at me surly, the man growled, and beckoned her to come closer with a wave of his pudgy hand. Let me see what I'm getting. Honora stifled a gasp of horror. Getting? Was she some sort of cow that needed to be examined for deficiencies before purchase? Honora winced when her uncle pushed her forward, and the old man grabbed her wrist in a firm hold. She looked down at him with disgust as he peered keenly at her with appraising eyes. She resisted the urge to rub her wrist when he finally let her go. Then the man went into a fit of coughing that had Honora jerking backwards immediately. She will do, the man said when he finally got his cough under control. Then he rose just as another bout of coughing seized him. Honora hastily stepped aside for him to brush past her. She heard him trying to talk as he and her uncle walked out the door. Struggling to put the ugly incident behind her, Honora returned to the kitchen and began making preparations for dinner. When she heard the front door slam some minutes later, she braced herself for what was coming. Prepare yourself, wench. You will be wed soon. The words didn't come as a surprise to her, but his choice of a husband for her confused her. She turned from the carrots that she was slicing to make beef stew and vegetables. Uncle Mervyn, is he what you really want for me? The man's brows shot up and a sinister smile curled his lips. Do you really think I care one way or the other who you wed? She shrugged. I know you don't, but I didn't think you would want to be looking for another husband for me so soon after my wedding to him. His face contorted in a frown. What's that supposed to mean? Uncle, you saw the pitiful state he's in. He might even die before we wed. He snorted. Benjamin has been coughing like that for years. Maybe it has gotten far worse. Don't you think so? He remained silent, looking at her with those cold eyes of his. "Uncle, I had thought that you would want to marry me off to someone at least young and successful, like the man who married Kate." Her uncle threw back his head, and mocking laughter erupted from his throat. Honora's face reddened. "I recall that you were vehemently against Kate's wedding. Now you want to marry someone like her husband?" Honora tried to look shamefaced, even though she didn't feel that way. She had to buy some time for Taylor to come and get her. That was if he would agree to do so. She lowered her head. "Perhaps I was too hasty in my decision then. But now I have seen things from a different perspective, thanks to Kate and Irene." He folded his arms across his chest and gave her a look filled with both mockery and disbelief. "Really? You want me to believe that you now want to be married?" Honora bobbed her head up and down. "I'm sort of lonely. After calling on Kate a number of times and seeing how happy she is, I realized that I might have been too hasty in my decision not to get married. Maybe I wasn't ready then, but I am now." "Then you will have no objections to marrying Benjamin," he said with a note of finality. Honora's heart lurched in her chest. The success of her departure to California was riding strongly against the conversation with her uncle. "Uncle, please find another suitor for me," she said in a meek tone. "Why?" "Because I don't wish to be a widow only a few months after my wedding." "I reckon you should be happy at that, because his wealth will become yours." "Are you sure that would be the case, Uncle Mervyn? Hasn't he been married before now? Doesn't he have children? How healthy is he really? If he has children, then I will be left with nothing or mere peanuts, because they will come and take it all from me. I have seen it happen before, and since my views on marriage have changed, I don't want to marry a man who would make me return to this house to start depending on you for my livelihood all over again. I believe you don't want that either." The silence in the kitchen was palpable enough to be cut with a knife. Just when she thought that her uncle didn't believe her, he sighed. "You make a persuasive argument. Very well, then. I'll find someone younger and more successful." It took everything inside Honora for her not to show her joy. If her uncle caught a whiff of how happy she was at his decision, he would swiftly change his mind. Something told her that he never wanted to see her happy. She wouldn't be surprised if he found a younger man as wicked as he was, just so that she could be unhappy with him. Well, he had no idea that she was going to pull a fast one on him. All she had to do now was write to Taylor and hope he would agree to the change of plans. Chapter 5. Taylor had just finished making plans to make the trip down to Montana when he heard a knock on the door. He frowned. He usually didn't have visitors, so he wondered who could be at the door. He had frowned when he received Honora's letter asking him to come for her instead. He had thought of canceling his offer, but when he remembered his correspondence with her, he changed his mind. He found Honora very interesting and different from all the women who often asked for him. She was proud, strong, and passionate. He figured that they would deal well with each other. Consequently, he had decided to go and fetch her. It would be quite an experience, and it would be very gentlemanly of him to do so. He rose to answer the door, hoping it wasn't Roger. He had been avoiding the man ever since he started showing up at his place of work to talk to him. It was beginning to border on shamelessness and perhaps desperation for the man to continue pestering him about marrying his daughter. Taylor was beginning to suspect that the main reason Roger was after him marrying Isabella was because he knew that he stood to gain a lot if he got the patent for his electricity transmission. He would have to disabuse the man of the notion so that he would let him be. These days, he had to sneak into town and out just to avoid the man. It was becoming frustrating, to say the least. Taylor stifled a groan when he opened the door and saw the man he had just been thinking about. Roger, garbed in all white attire, smiled broadly at him. "Taylor," he said with his booming voice, "how are you doing?" Taylor bit back an angry retort. He had to get to Montana as soon as possible to claim his bride. He didn't have time for this. "I'm fine, Roger. What brings you around these parts?" he asked with as much sarcasm as he could gather. The man laughed. "Won't you invite me in?" he asked. Taylor just stood there looking at him. Hiding a frown by rubbing his clean-shaven chin, Taylor took a step back and waved a hand for him to come into the house. Grinning, Roger removed his white hat and entered. Taylor reluctantly led the way to his sitting room. He carried the chair from behind the table and placed it near the window for Roger to sit. "Thank you," Roger said, and settled down on it while he stood beside the window with his arms folded across his chest. "Now, Roger, why are you here?" he questioned, in a no-nonsense tone. Roger reclined on the chair and grinned. "Isabella's birthday is coming up, and she told me just this morning how she would love to be wed on her birthday. So I thought to myself, that's a mighty fine idea. That day would always be special to her. She would have 2 things to celebrate every year." Taylor lowered his head and pinched the bridge of his nose. If he had known that Roger was indeed the one on the other side of the door, he wouldn't have opened it. He would have pretended that he wasn't at home. "That's very wonderful, Roger," he said, for want of something better to say. "That's why I'm here, Taylor. Isabella is my only child, and I'll do anything for her. When her mother died," the man bowed his head and sniffed. "God rest her sweet soul. She told me to always do whatever I could for our daughter. I've wanted Isabella to marry all these years, but she hasn't found a man she loved until she met you weeks ago." Taylor pushed himself from the window when he saw tears rolling down the man's face. Was this for real? Or had Isabella put her father up to this and taught him how to cry at the drop of a hat? Shifting uncomfortably at seeing a grown man weeping over what Taylor considered to be a lost cause, he resolved to look away. Roger continued his sorry tale. "She hasn't spoken of anything else except being wed to you. I am a man who loves his daughter and would give her anything she asked for. You very well know that she has always wished to be your wife. So from one man to another, I plead with you to reconsider your stand against marrying my daughter. Yes, I brought Isabella up to be pampered, but it's what she deserves, and more. You know, she's a very beautiful woman who needs to be treated like a queen. And from the good things that have been said about you around town, I reckon that you're the man to treat her so. I have thrown away all my pride to be here today to beg you to marry my daughter. Isabella has threatened to go on a hunger strike if you don't marry her. You wouldn't want such a lovely creature to starve to death, would you? Not when you could do something about it? Therefore, I want you to think of Isabella. Think of how she's suffering and make her your wife. I assure you that you won't regret it. As a matter of fact, the only thing you will regret is not making her yours before now. She will make you a good wife. You don't have to worry about the expenses that will be incurred in the course of preparing for the wedding. They will be taken care of by me. I will also fund your project as a wedding gift. You might choose to live in the state with me or build your own place. I will help you achieve whichever one you want. So, what do you say?" Taylor sighed with relief when the man finally stopped talking. Land's sakes, he had thought the man would go on and never stop. He hadn't known that Roger was quite a talker. It nearly drove him crazy when the man wouldn't stop talking. Taylor wanted to go to bed early so that he wouldn't miss the train that would take him to Montana the following day. So, the earlier he replied to Roger, the better for him. He cleared his throat, looking directly at the man. Amusement filled his eyes when Roger brought out a white handkerchief and began dabbing his eyes with it. "Roger, I can't tell you how flattered I am about all you just told me," he began quietly. "However, I have told you repeatedly that I do not wish to marry now," he fibbed once more to get the man off his back. "I'm very grateful for your interest in me, but please, I would prefer if it were channeled towards someone else. Please extend my apologies to your daughter. No doubt she's a very beautiful woman and would make a good wife, but sadly, I'm not the man for her." Silence descended on the room after his explanation. Taylor expected Roger to rise and leave. When the man rose a few minutes later, Taylor smiled inwardly. Perhaps this would be the last time that he would ever come to him with the marriage proposition. Taylor's eyes widened when he looked at Roger and saw intense anger in the man's eyes. "Taylor, I have been very nice and pleasant to you, but it looks as if you're taking me for a fool. Do you think I'm stupid?" Taylor could only stare at the infuriated man. "For weeks now, I have been asking you to marry my daughter. I even came here to beg you to do so, and you dare to refuse my request? Who do you think you are, anyway?" Taylor pursed his lips to keep from saying anything. When the man finished running his mouth, he would leave and never come back. Hopefully. Roger drew closer. "I reckon that you don't know who I am, do you? I'm a very wealthy and influential man, in case you aren't aware of it. One word in the right ears and you're done here, boy. You will never find work here or in the whole of California ever again. So if I were you, I would tread cautiously or bid your electricity project goodbye." Taylor had been willing to let the man finish talking and then ask him to leave, but the fact that he was now threatening him, Taylor knew that he couldn't take that lying down. He straightened his posture. "Are you by any chance threatening me, Roger?" "Call it whatever you like, Taylor. I don't care. You'd better reconsider marrying my daughter, or this town won't be conducive for you to live in." Taylor had heard enough to know when he was being threatened. Smiling tautly, he said, "Roger, your threats won't work on me. I have lawyers who can end your mining empire should you dare harm my work. I have heard of you cutting corners just to make sure your mining company is running the way you want it. I know you wouldn't want my lawyers snooping around the place and talking to your workers." Roger's face had become a stony mask of fury. "You wouldn't dare," he said between clenched teeth. "Don't test me, Roger. I don't want to marry your daughter, and it's final." "You will regret this, Taylor. I promise you." Taylor snorted and watched as Roger placed his hat on his head and strode out of the sitting room. Taylor didn't bother seeing him to the door. He let out a heavy sigh when he heard the front door slam heavily, shaking the entire house. Well, at least he won't show up at my house uninvited again. Taylor pondered the incident for a while and then pushed it aside. His thoughts returned to the journey he was about to take the following day. And so, the following morning, Taylor boarded the train heading far east. Chapter 6. With a heavy sigh of relief, Taylor rose from his seat as the train drew to a stop at the final train station in Montana. He stretched his stiff limbs. He didn't know that train rides could be this tedious. Not that he would have changed anything had he known before now. All he hoped for now was that the journey would be worth it. All through the trip, he had wondered if he was doing the right thing. What if Honora turned out to be the total opposite of her letters? What if she took one look at him and decided that she didn't like him? Would he have made the trip for nothing? Taylor let out a soft sigh. All these speculations wouldn't do him any good. It would get him worrying over something he couldn't do anything about. Removing his hat, he brushed it across his black coat, brown shirt, and black trousers. What a sight he must be, all dusty and dirty. He wouldn't be surprised if she indeed took one look at him and decided that he wasn't the one after all. Taylor wished that he could find a place to quickly clean up before meeting with her. He searched desperately for any washroom or room with privacy, but to no avail. She would just have to make do with whatever she saw. The cheering and yelling in the train had increased as some of the passengers saw their family and friends waiting for them at the platform. Taylor hoped that he would be that enthusiastic when he saw Honora. Taylor wouldn't mind if Honora wasn't beautiful. He preferred women to be able to offer more than their looks. However, he didn't want her to be so unattractive that looking at her would take a lot of effort. "Will you take the next train out of Montana if you discover that she's homely?" Certainly not. He would take her as he saw her, and he hoped she would do the same. Taylor took his small bag and stepped down from the train, blinking at the intense rays of the sun. The gangplank was teeming with people moving about. He placed his hat on his head and looked around him. His eyes skimmed the men, women, and children at the station. His gaze narrowed on two women standing a few feet away from the gangplank. When the women continued to look at him with interest, Taylor surmised that one of them was Honora and the other was the companion that she wrote to him about. He became very nervous to meet Honora. What if she didn't like him? Pull yourself together, Taylor. You don't want her to think that you're a ninny, do you? Taylor strode forward, covering the distance between him and the two women. When he reached them, he tipped his hat and offered them a small smile. The taller of the two women took his breath away. Gray, slightly slanted eyes stared at him with curiosity from an oval face that he could stare at all day. Her small forehead, pert nose, rosy cheeks, and full lips had him gawking at her. Although her skin was tanned, he noted how soft it looked. As he approached, he couldn't help noticing her hourglass figure encased in a light brown calico dress. He had no doubt in his mind that this stunning woman was Honora. The curly dark brown hair peeking from underneath her gray bonnet was his first clue. Realizing that he was gawking at Honora, his face reddened. "You're Honora, miss?" He pointed at the woman he assumed to be the woman he sought. The bright smile that spread across her face tugged at his heart. "Disappointed?" she asked, her eyes raking him from his hat to his dusty boots. Taylor couldn't guess if she was jesting. Before he could tell her that he was actually impressed, she said, "This is Irene Woods," and dashed a nervous glance behind her. Taylor turned to fix his eyes on the petite, blonde-haired woman with curious brown eyes. She was quite beautiful, with a round face, button nose, and rosebud lips. Although she couldn't hold a candle to Honora, she would catch any man's interest. Again, before Taylor could say anything, Honora nodded towards the train. "Best we get going," she announced in a high tone. She and her companion shared an uneasy glance and took hasty steps forward. "What's the hurry? I was thinking that we could talk before boarding the train. Besides, I would like to stretch my legs a bit. The trip wasn't particularly enjoyable." Letting out a tense laugh, Honora dashed her tongue across her lips and said, "Pardon us, but we need to leave post-haste. My uncle will notice that I'm missing from the house any minute now. I need to be on that train before he discovers that." Taylor watched with amazement as the women left him standing there and rushed in the direction of the train. Sighing, he picked up their large trunk and hurried after them. What in Sam Hill was going on, and why had they packed only one trunk? He had just reached the train when the trainmaster called for the new passengers to get on board. Taylor searched his coat pocket for their tickets and handed them to the man. His eyes widened when the women darted frantically into the train. Sighing at what he had gotten himself into, he followed them into the train. They found empty seats by the door and settled in after he sorted out their trunk. "Start talking," he said in a firm tone immediately after they were seated. Honora and Irene glanced out the window before his mail-order bride fixed him with a nervous stare without saying a word. "Why does it seem as if you're running away from your uncle?" Taylor folded his arms across his chest. Honora clicked her tongue before saying, "My uncle wishes to wed me to a man old enough to be my father, who is also as sick as a dog." Taylor's eyes widened a little, but he kept his face expressionless. She needed to say more for him to understand. She continued fiercely, "My uncle is a despicable man. He had me working like a slave in his mines. While I recognize that a man is the head of the home, I don't think a woman should be sold off in marriage. I think women should be given the opportunity to choose what they want to do with their lives. It's quite appalling that men feel it's their sole right to dictate what a woman ought to do with her future." Taylor was so stunned that he didn't know what to say. Honora hadn't mentioned anything about her uncle ill-treating her, and now she was running away? Taylor stared at the woman who kept looking out the window with her hand against her chest. Irene was also engaged in a fitful stare outside. Both women sighed with relief when they heard the train's engine come to life. They turned and hugged each other with excitement immediately when the train started moving. "I can't believe we're doing this," Irene said after she pulled away from Honora. "This is life." Honora nodded. "It certainly is." And just when he thought he ought to yell for the train to be stopped, Honora turned in her seat to bestow him with a broad smile. "Thank you," she quietly said, and gripped Irene's hand. Those calmly spoken words left him speechless. He hadn't expected her gratitude when he was already having second thoughts about taking her with him to California. Taylor nodded and reclined in his seat. Something told him that this journey back to California was going to be very eventful. Chapter 7. The trip was just like Taylor had anticipated. He found it difficult to take his eyes off Honora. He hadn't expected her to be this beautiful and spirited. Oh, Honora was quite a feisty woman. He had listened continually to her views concerning human rights. She strongly believed that everybody should be treated equally, no matter their gender or financial status. I see it as highly unfair for a woman to be seen as little more than a sheep, Honora said with disdain. Taylor guffawed and wondered humorously how he had gotten himself into this. I agree with you, Honora. Women have been treated unfairly throughout history. It's time things changed, Irene agreed with her. What do you think about that, Taylor? Honora directed her question to him when he simply continued looking at them with a small smile on his face. I very much agree with both of you. Women need to be listened to. I have no problem with that, he replied, wishing that Honora would leave him out of the conversation. He was more interested in hearing what she had to say. He had never met a woman who wasn't shy in saying what she had in mind. For a moment, he wondered how her uncle had managed her when she was so outspoken. Had she lied about him, or was her forthrightness the reason her uncle had mistreated her? Taylor couldn't deny the fact that he was impressed by Honora's ideas and worldview, but he was also dumbstruck that a woman could be so spirited, fiery, and passionate about how she felt women ought to be treated. His eyes lifted and caught her gray ones. Something he couldn't describe passed through him the instant their eyes met. Her lips parted, and he locked his gaze on them. Yes, there was a mutual attraction between him and Honora. He couldn't deny that. Yes, they would fit well together. Blushing, Honora looked away. Irene had brought out a book to read. Taylor let out a satisfied smile. Truly, this would be a very interesting journey, not just to California, but also for the rest of their lives together. He couldn't wait for the rest of their lives to begin. He dared believe that there would be no dull moment with this riveting young woman. He sought to engage her in more conversation so that he could get her views concerning other things as well. But with the blush deepening on her cheeks and her refusal to look in his direction, he decided to let her be for the moment. Taylor closed his eyes just as the train drew to a stop in front of a station for some of the passengers to alight from it. About an hour of sleep would do him a lot of good. He hadn't slept much during his trip to Montana. Worry concerning what he should expect had kept him awake most nights. A sharp gasp had him opening his eyes instantly. Honora, with her mouth wide open, her eyes almost popping out from their sockets, was staring behind him. Taylor turned his body in the direction of her gaze and saw a large man walking down the aisle. He was involved in a loud argument with another man. He turned around to ask Honora if she knew the man when she suddenly shot to her feet, her face an unreadable mask. "Honora," he called out, but he might as well have been talking to himself. Before he could grab her hand and ask her what was going on, she bounded out of the train. Shock held Taylor immobile for some seconds. He and Irene shared bemused looks. Taylor swore inwardly and rose. He knew Honora was going to be quite a handful and the journey to California was going to be eventful. But he hadn't thought that his assumptions would prove as accurate this soon. He rushed out of the train, nudging people alighting from the train in his hurry to go after his mail-order bride. Chapter 8. She hadn't stopped to think before she ran out of the train in pursuit of the man she had thought she would never come across again. The sound of his voice was the first thing that had caught her attention. She had thought she was hearing things, but as the large man threateningly raised his hand to the man he was talking to, all the breath had rushed out of her. "Oh, goodness! What on earth have I done?" Honora's steps faltered to a halt. She looked with despair as the train hooted and continued on its journey in the opposite direction. The scarred hand, the voice. Those sent her back in time to when her father had been shot on a train. She'd been nervous to board a train again, though what a cruel twist of fate to be on the same train as her father's murderer yet again. So, without thinking, in a moment of rage, she had gone after the man. She had no idea what she would do when she confronted him. All she had thought of then was going after him. Now the train was heading for Boise City without her. Honora panicked at the thought of being stranded there alone. Irene and Taylor would certainly be worried sick about her. She sighed in despair. She would just have to find a way to join them. The careless deed had already been done. All she had to do now was see it through. to the end. However, when she looked around at the thick bushes surrounding her with only a narrow trail leading to the town, she sighed. If she hadn't been so enraged, she would have sought to think well about it before giving chase to the man she was rapidly losing sight of in the thick bushes. Honora didn't have a plan when she burst out of the train. All she did was see him and act on pure impulse. Yet she had to catch him. What she would do when she caught up with the man, Honora hadn't thought that far ahead. She hadn't known that the town was further down the trail. She had thought that she would follow him there, and hopefully there would be a sheriff to whom she could report him. It seemed like a silly idea, given the fact that she had no evidence to prove that he was an outlaw who had murdered people that fateful day. But she surmised that if she screamed hard and loud enough, she was bound to get someone's attention, and then maybe someone might look into it. Maybe she could write to Kate to come over and corroborate her story without their uncle's knowledge. Honora hastened her steps as she realized that if she didn't hurry, she would lose the man. All she could hear now was his heavy footsteps. It was quite surprising that none of the others who alighted had come this way. They had all gone in the opposite direction, making her wonder what was there. The heat from the sun was unbearable. She removed her bonnet and used it as a fan across her sweaty face. It was no use. Hot air ruined her efforts. Honora sighed as her dress began to stick to her body. Her heart jumped when she heard the sound of voices, and a short moment later it was accompanied by horses' hooves. "No!" she cried, and began running in the direction of the sound. She gritted her teeth as she took in the departing figures of the outlaw and another man who had probably kept a horse waiting for him. Honora let out a frustrated sigh. Her sudden departure from the train was all for naught. Now she was lost, with no knowledge of how she would meet up with Irene and Taylor. She was suddenly filled with the dread of being entirely alone. Honora, disappointed, turned around and let out a huge gasp. A big, burly, dark mass blocked her view. Upon further inspection, her eyes widened when she realized a large grizzly bear stood just feet in front of her. She stopped herself from screaming. Just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, the animal let out a loud growl. Honora's heart beat rapidly against her chest. She chewed on her bottom lip as she wondered if she would make it if she ran in the direction of the town. Not that she knew how far it was. Sweat trickled down her face. She would just have to take the risk and hope for the best. She was just about to move when she heard the sound of a cracking twig. "Don't move," Taylor hissed at her. Honora froze. Where did he come from? She saw Taylor standing behind the bear, his expression fearful but also held steadfast by courage and determination. Honora had never been more relieved in her life than in that moment. At first, even though she hid it well, she hadn't been able to take her eyes off Taylor. Since escaping from Raven had been her driving motive, she hadn't truly allowed herself to think of Taylor's appearance while they exchanged correspondence. Now, gazing upon the tall and handsome man with thick black hair, a pale face, and startling blue eyes, had left her breathless. "What are you doing?" she said in a loud whisper, trying to hide her joy at his sudden appearance. Taylor didn't reply to her. He gently picked up a stone and threw it to his right to attract the bear's attention. "Run!" Taylor shouted. Honora lifted her skirts and made a run for it in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, the bear went after her instead of going for Taylor. Honora increased her pace, struggling to run down the dirt trail. "Get down!" she heard Taylor shout and quickly dove to the ground. Bam! The sound resounded in the air, almost deafening Honora. She lifted her head and watched with horror as the bear dropped to the ground in a heavy thud. Taylor had shot it right between the eyes. "What did you do that for?" she asked, shocked. She stared at the dead animal lying limp on the ground. Still heaving with adrenaline and fear, Honora stood motionless, bewildered as she processed what had just happened and how close to death she had been. Taylor calmly stood his ground. "I was saving you, I think." "What on earth am I doing?" she thought. I should be grateful Taylor followed my trail and came to my rescue. She didn't dare to think what would have become of her otherwise. "Thank you, Taylor," she said at last, recovering from her initial shock. Rising to her feet and brushing the dust off her dress, she asked, "You had to kill it? Could you not have just startled it?" Honora raised her head when Taylor didn't reply to her accusing question. She noted that he was looking at her with something akin to bemusement. Her face turned a rosy hue. She was grateful to him for coming to her rescue, but maybe a shot in the air would have frightened the animal into running away. Now the animal was dead. Who knew if it was a mother who had cubs in the forest awaiting her return? The poor things would be without a mother now, all because Taylor had decided to kill instead of maim. When Taylor didn't say anything but continued to look at her as if he had never seen such a woman before, her pallor darkened. She did sound ungrateful, but she was against hurting animals unless it was absolutely necessary. She hated violence in general. Nevertheless, she had to acknowledge that what he did was brave and heroic. This man had leapt out of a train to pursue her and keep her safe. Killing the bear was wrong, but Taylor's drive to protect a woman not yet his wife was compelling. With her head lowered, she walked up to him and sighed. She elevated her head and said in a quiet voice, "Thank you for coming to my rescue. It was very courageous of you." He simply nodded and walked away, leaving her to wonder if she hadn't ruined everything that might have developed between them with her harsh tone. Chapter 9. Taylor smiled as he watched Honora and Irene run into each other's arms. He had sensed how worried Honora was throughout their journey to find Irene. Without saying a word to her, he had led the way out of the bushes. They managed to board a stagecoach to make their way to the next town post haste. All their plans had suddenly gone awry because of Honora's spontaneous move. The silence between them had been thick enough to cut, with a knife inside the stagecoach. Taylor had chosen not to say a word to her. He had been afraid that he might speak in haste. He didn't know why she ran out of the train, but he didn't think he knew any other woman who would have stared an angry bear in the face. Then she turned around to accuse him of killing the animal that had been trying to hurt her. Few women had left him so speechless. Honora was truly different. Taylor had been stunned by the incident. He had found the whole thing intriguing and almost hilarious. Any other woman would have either swooned or fallen into his arms in gratitude, but not Honora. No, the feisty woman would very much prefer to chew his hide before thanking him. "Thank you for finding her and bringing her here safely," Irene told him immediately as she pulled out of her friend's arms. "I was very worried about both of you. I had to alight from the train and wait here, hoping that you would both come and find me." Taylor simply nodded, enjoying Honora's flushed face. The woman refused to meet his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Irene," Honora said quietly. "So what was that all about?" Irene's voice was laced with concern. Taylor looked around them. They shouldn't stand in front of the train station talking about what had pushed Honora into leaving the train so abruptly. The town was quite small, but thankfully an inn was nearby. "I think we ought to book rooms for the night. We'll have to wait here until the next train comes along," he mentioned to both women who nodded. Taylor led the way to the inn positioned at the end of the street. Taylor went into the white stone building. Thankfully, the place could offer them 2 rooms. He would reside in one while Irene and Honora would stay in the other. Though it was early, they decided to dine before retiring to their rooms for the night. The day had been filled with such excitement and emotion that everyone was ready to retire. While the 3 were eating a poor meal of potatoes, beef stew, and stale white bread, Honora broke the heavy silence and apologized to them for the way she had left the train. "I saw a man on the train who looked familiar. He was the outlaw who killed my father a year ago. I just knew that I had to confront him. I don't know why, although I suppose it was in hopes of having him arrested by the sheriff if I caught him. I had no idea that I would lose him." "I'm so sorry," she said with deep emotion. Irene took her hand across the table. "Oh, Honora, how dreadful. What a fright you gave us. Why did you leap after him? You could have got into so much trouble." Taylor swallowed tautly. At least now he understood why she had acted impulsively. Her actions seemed very daring to him, but it was clear now that there was no reasoning with Honora once she had set her mind on something. His heart went out to her, and he swore within him to protect her at all costs. Honora carried on with her story. She told Irene of the bear. When she reached the part of him shooting the bear, he stopped her and changed the subject. "Are you all right?" he asked Irene, who nodded and smiled. I am now that I know both of you are all right, she replied with relief. They had a quiet time conversing at the table. At the end of the evening, Irene bid them good night and went up to the room. Honora wanted to go with her, but Taylor stopped her. I apologize that you had to witness me killing the bear. I'm not a cruel man. I feared for your life. I was worried I'd miss out on a life with you. A shy smile tugged at Honora's lips. She looked away and said, Well then, get us to California safely. I assure you that life with me would be sensational, she teased, with a giggle. Leaning against the chair and regarding her with amused eyes, Taylor said, Are you sure of that? I'm beginning to think that I might have bitten off more than I can chew with you. Honora burst into a fit of laughter. You won't regret getting to know me, I promise. He cocked an eyebrow. That remains to be seen, but I dare say that you might be right. I haven't run after a woman who jumped out of a train before, nor met one who caused me to shoot a bear. She smirked and raised an eyebrow. You see, I reckon that you won't have a single dull moment with me. He shared in her laughter. Silence descended between them in the empty common room. Taylor felt a strange tug in his heart. It was so peculiar. It had him wondering what it was. I'll bid you good night now, she said, and rose swiftly. Taylor quickly got up. I'll see you to your room. She presented him with a bright smile. He followed her up the stairs and stopped beside her room. Good night, Taylor, she said quietly. Good night, Honora, he replied, finding it difficult to move toward his room beside hers. Honora also didn't open her door immediately. They both stood there looking at each other. Taylor lifted his hand to cup her face when she opened the door. He swiftly dropped his hand and nodded to her. Sleep did not come easily for Taylor that night. He lay awake, kept up by thoughts of Honora and the life that lay before them. Chapter 10. Honora sighed with relief when the train pulled to a stop at its Utah station. It meant that they would get to come down for a bit and stretch their stiff legs. Although no incident like the one she had experienced with her brother and father had taken place on the train, she was still wary of the conveyance. Sometimes memories of how her brother and father were killed flooded her, and tears would sting her eyes. At such times, she would be so consumed with sorrow, she would become very quiet. Taylor and Irene tried to draw her out at such times. Usually, for their sake, she would pretend to be happy again, but from the intense way Taylor stared at her, she believed that he knew she was faking it. It couldn't be helped. She missed her family. Even though she and Kate were very different, she missed her sister dearly. She wished Kate had agreed to come with her, but she had refused to leave her husband. Alas, Honora couldn't blame her. They all had different paths to follow in life, and she would never force her sister to live hers. She could only wish her sister well. Honora, Taylor, and Irene went for a walk around the small town. Before long, they heard the train hooting and the trainmaster calling for all to board. Irene and Taylor boarded the train ahead of her. Honora took a deep breath and let it out slowly. As Honora was about to step into the train, a man bumped into her, darting past as he bullied his way through the crowd and stole a passenger's handbag. The man jumped into the train just as it was about to leave, leaving the old woman stunned and helpless. "Thief!" the woman shrieked. "Please stop him!" Honora had seen the man's hand just as he entered the train. The scarred hand that gripped the stolen purse was the same scarred hand of the man who had killed her father. Angrily, Honora jumped on the train as well. "Honora!" Taylor and Irene called in unison. But Honora didn't listen to them. Reacting based on impulse and fury, Honora ran after the man. "That man is a thief! Somebody stop him!" she shouted at the passengers, but they looked at her like she was deranged. The outlaw, noting that she was running after him, wove in and out of coaches to escape his pursuer. The passengers, stunned and confused, stood there immobile as they watched the scene unfold, taking no action or attempt to catch the mugger. Honora gritted her teeth at the useless men and women who stood frozen. She sighed with relief when she realized that the train wasn't gaining speed, but instead drawing to a stop. At least now they would be able to catch the man, and she would have proof of one of his offenses for him to be sent to prison. Honora smiled. She couldn't have planned it better. Breathing heavily from her race, Honora's legs ground to a halt at the last cabin. Anger creased the man's forehead. Honora's smile faltered when the man headed for the exit and jumped down from the train. Appalled that her plan to have him arrested wouldn't work if he wasn't caught, Honora threw herself off the train as well. She lost her footing and slid to the ground on her derriere. The man stopped running and turned around. He laughed when he saw her seated on the dirt road. "Give it back, you coward!" she screamed at him. The robber threw back his head and laughed heartily. "I'd like to see you take it from me." Honora's eyes widened when she saw the evil glint in the man's eyes. Chapter 11. "I swear this woman will be the death of me," Taylor muttered, exasperated, as he waited for the train to come to a complete stop. Thank goodness he had been able to get the trainmaster to stop the train so that he could go after Honora. Why she thought it was fine for her to jump off a moving train was beyond him. That woman was wild. She had promised him a life of adventure. He was beginning to question whether he was up for it. His heart might just give way due to too much pressure on it. If he had to watch her alight from a train in the most unladylike of manners all through the journey, he feared what she would have in store for him when they reached California. "Please find her," Irene said a few feet from him. She had her arms around the trembling old woman who had been robbed. Taylor inwardly shook his head. If he had wanted a normal, docile wife, he wouldn't have left California in the first place. He would have simply married Isabella. Honora was everything he needed in his life and more. She already shared his views, which was wonderful to him. All he had to do now was to have a talk with her about her impulses. She would get herself killed if she continued at this pace. Taylor gritted his teeth as the train took a long time to ease to a stop. He tried to appease a frightened Irene and asked her to wait for them at the station. The train had barely come to a complete halt when Taylor jumped off the train to find Honora. His face fell when he couldn't see his brown-haired beauty among the townsfolk moving about. Where in Sam Hill would he find her? Taylor sighed and began running in the direction where Honora got off the train. He cursed when he reached the edge of the train station and couldn't find her. Fear snaked up his spine as he wondered what could have happened to her. What if the man had captured her? Where would he find her? Taylor decided that he would go into the town and ask around if anyone had seen Honora. Surely the man couldn't drag her through the town. Honora, he knew, wouldn't allow that. She would fight the man all the way, drawing attention to herself. An inn stood at the outskirts of the town. Taylor decided that he would start his search there. Quickly, he strode up the wooden staircase and walked into the place. He removed his hat and looked around the place at the men and women seated there. "What can I do for you?" The proprietress of the place walked up to him. "Pardon me, madam. I was wondering if you had seen a tall woman with curly brown hair." The robust woman with a cream apron tied at her waist looked him up and down appreciatively. "No, I didn't see anyone like that," she answered in a drawl. "But you could take your load off here. I make some pretty nice beef stew." Registering that the woman wouldn't be of any help to him, Taylor tipped his hat at her, turned and left the place. He walked down the steps and moved toward the next building, a dressmaker's shop, when the door opened and a man with a limp hobbled out, calling after Taylor. "For the right coin, I could tell you where the woman is," the man with tobacco-stained teeth croaked. Taylor didn't know whether to believe him or not, but since he didn't have a lot of choices, he dipped his hand in his coat pocket and threw a coin at him. The man expertly caught it and pointed in the direction of another inn. "She and one man went that way," the man said with a grin. Taylor shook his head. He knew what the man was thinking. The informant probably thought that he was a jealous husband in search of an unfaithful wife. He thanked the man and quickly walked toward the inn. Taylor's eyes narrowed when he reached a dilapidated red brick building. As he started to climb the broken steps, he heard the unmistakable sound of Honora's voice. It didn't come from inside the inn, but from the back. Quickly, Taylor retrieved his pistol from his jacket and darted to the back of the building. He placed his back against the wall and peeked out from his position. Honora was struggling with the man who had captured her and was airing her lungs at him. It appeared that the man was trying to drag Honora down a trail. He recognized the man as the same one who she said had killed her father, the same outlaw from the train the first time. That knowledge spurred him into action. The man was dangerous and wouldn't hesitate to hurt Honora. Taylor brought out his pistol and stepped away from his hiding position. "Stop!" The man whirled around with Honora in his arms. Her eyes widened, and even from the short distance that he stood, he heard her sigh of relief. "Taylor!" she cried out with joy. Taylor tried to focus on the snarling man rather than on Honora's beautiful and smiling face. "Let her go!" he shouted to the man. "I don't think you should be telling me what to do," the man snarled. "I'll hurt her." "I'll make sure you regret setting eyes on her if you dare hurt her," Taylor promised, with an edge in his voice. The undeniable threat in his voice had the man's eyes widening. He wasn't one to partake in violence if he could use dialogue, but if the man dared try to hurt Honora, he wouldn't hesitate to act. Moments later, Taylor realized that he needn't even have been worried about Honora. As Taylor stood there, pistol aimed at the outlaw, he watched as Honora bit down hard on the man's arm holding her, stamped on his foot with her heel, and yanked the bag out of his arms. Honora made a run for it just as the man cursed loudly and brought a pistol out of his coat. Taylor didn't waste any time in firing a warning shot at the man. The bullet whizzed past the man's ears and he ducked. Taylor caught Honora in the curve of his arm just as he and the man started to exchange fire. He pushed her out of sight around the corner and told her to run. The fire continued. Then silence. When Taylor peeked out from his position at the wall, it was to find that the man had fled. Taylor reckoned that the man had run out of bullets and fled. Taylor stood resolute, waiting for a few moments to be certain that the man wouldn't suddenly return. When he confirmed that the threat had indeed left, Taylor went in search of Honora. He found her seated in front of the inn, clasping the bag tightly in her arms. Taylor was filled with mixed emotions. He was relieved to see her alive, but he was also exasperated with her. He was torn between the desire to embrace her or throttle her. How could she be so careless when all he wanted to do was keep her safe? Instead, he jerked her into his arms and held her tight for a moment. When they drew apart, he firmly said, "Don't ever do that again, Honora." "I'm sorry." "It's not enough for you to be sorry. You must promise me that you will never run off again." She nodded. "I understand. I'm sorry. It just brought back memories of the train robbery. I knew that I couldn't let it go." "He would have hurt you," he pressed. She needed to know that she couldn't be so careless with her life anymore. "I realize that now. I wasn't thinking. Thank you for coming to rescue me. Again." Taylor sighed. At least she was remorseful, but how long would it last? He ached to draw her into his arms again. "Let's go and find Irene," Honora said calmly. "She must be very worried." He wanted to tell her that she should have thought of that before flying off, but he decided not to continue chiding her. He could read in her eyes that she was shaken. So he simply nodded, and together they walked back to the train. A fierce need to protect her overwhelmed him, making him realize at that instant that he would never let her go. Chapter 12. "Thank you very much. God bless you," the old woman said as Honora returned the stolen bag. "My money, it's all here. I was afraid that outlaw took it. I wouldn't have been able to survive until my son sent me more money. All thanks to you." Even though what she had done was reckless, Honora was grateful that she had done it. The tears rolling down the woman's cheeks showed that it was worth it. She held the old woman's hands and smiled. "You're all welcome to stay in my house until the next train comes along," the old woman invited with a small smile. Honora lifted her eyes to see if Taylor and Irene were in agreement. Her smile vanished from her face when her gaze settled on Irene. Irene's frown made Honora's brows rise in surprise. "Irene, is everything all right?" Irene's frown deepened. "Only you would ask me that after acting like a sheriff." Honora giggled but ended it quickly when Irene placed her hands on her hips and gave her a stern look. Honora made her face expressionless. "You scared the daylights out of me. Again! Could you please stop jumping out of trains?" Irene asked in a no-nonsense tone. "I'm sorry, Irene," Honora apologized, acknowledging that her friend must have really been worried about her. "I will never do it again." "Do you promise?" Honora nodded and smiled. The two women hugged. Honora blushed when she felt Taylor's intense gaze on her face. By the time they reached the town, news had spread about Taylor and Honora's bravery. The townsfolk asked them to stay at the inn for free. A dance was coming up, so they begged them to stay until the next train came. Not having a choice in the matter, the trio agreed. The sheriff personally came to thank them. It appeared that they had been having issues with outlaws snatching the belongings of the townsfolk. Honora wanted to put as much distance between her and her uncle as possible, but she was happy that they had agreed to stay in the town. The townsfolk were very welcoming. They treated them like royalty, offering free meals and even going as far as presenting Honora and Irene with new dresses for the dance. Honora swirled her lovely blue silk lace dress with silver ribbon trimmings. The matching blue bonnet on her head brought a smile to her lips. She couldn't remember the last time she had dressed this fancy. She had even been provided with ankle boots to go with the dress. Irene was looking equally beautiful in a yellow dress that complemented the color of her hair. Both women left their rooms to meet Taylor, who would escort them to the dance at the town square. A shy smile graced Honora's lips when she saw the way Taylor responded to their appearance when they met him in the common room. He slowly rose from his chair as his eyes raked her from her bonnet to her boots. He glanced in Irene's direction, but his gaze returned back to her immediately. He swallowed tightly, seemingly finding it hard to say something. Honora noticed that he had changed clothes as well. The black coat, cream-colored shirt, brown waistcoat, and black trousers made him look even more handsome than he already was. "I dare say that I'm going to be the most envied man at the dance," he stated with a grin, and both women smiled. He offered them his arms and led them out of the place. They were the focus of all eyes as they approached the town square, where the dance was already in full swing. A long table was laden with enough to eat and drink. A man immediately approached Irene as they reached the place, leaving Honora alone with Taylor. Her heart did little jumps in her chest when Taylor took her in his arms to dance the Texas two-step. "You're easily the most beautiful woman here, you know," he whispered into her ear, sending shivers up her body. By the time the evening and the dance were over, Honora had to acknowledge the feelings she'd been avoiding. She had barely let herself consider these feelings, but it was true. She was in love with Taylor. He was simply the perfect man for her. Not only was he radical and modern, he was also traditional and gallant at the same time. They were not even wed yet, and here he was already risking his life to keep her safe, chasing outlaws and bears, leaping out of trains, all for her. They danced several times that evening and then sat down to eat as they watched others dance. They spoke extensively on several topics. Honora felt as if she had known Taylor all her life. She told him about her late family and her sister. He told her about how frustrating it had been being an only child. Her heart went out to him when he mentioned that his father had never supported his ideas. She knew how it felt for a family member not to believe in your ideas. After some time, Taylor walked her back to the inn. Irene had gone ahead of them, stating that she was tired. Honora could sense that Taylor didn't want to leave her. As the feeling was reciprocated, she suggested that they sit on the broken steps of the inn. They spent a long time there in companionable silence before Honora sighed and told him that she wanted to retire. At her door, Honora's heart nearly jumped out of her chest when Taylor leaned in and placed a kiss on her cheek. Honora could think of nothing else that night. She had never been in love before. The closest she knew about a man and a woman in love was her late parents. Now she understood why her father always sought her mother out, why they always held hands and shared small smiles. Her parents used to go for walks holding hands. They used to sit for hours on their porch, talking far into the night. Honora wanted to do all that and more with Taylor. She hoped her feelings were reciprocated, because if that wasn't so, she didn't know what she would do with herself. Chapter 13. Honora and her companions were sad to leave the quaint town and welcoming people, but they had to when the train came the following day to take them on the next leg of their journey. They had tarried enough, and the unexpected delays had extended their journey. At this rate, it would take them weeks to arrive in California. With a pang of guilt, she realized these delays were her fault. As she sat on the train, Honora found it hard to keep her thoughts of Taylor. They kept exchanging small smiles. Honora blushed when she saw Irene giving her a knowing look above her book after catching her staring at Taylor, who was slumbering. With each passing day, Honora recognized that she was falling more and more in love with Taylor. It wasn't only that he was handsome, he was courteous. Whenever she recalled the kiss he had placed on her cheek, she blushed. Taylor reminded her of her father, a kind gentleman who was polite and considerate. She recalled his hand on hers while they danced and giggled. She had been shocked to register that he had soft hands, not the coarse hands she was used to from miners, farmers, and ranchers. Honora was still daydreaming about how her marriage to Taylor would be when the train pulled to a stop in one of its stations. She was glad that they would soon be in California, so that she could start a new life with the man she loved. She raised her head to observe as some of the passengers stepped down from the train and more came. Her eyes widened when she recognized one of the men entering the train as one of her uncle's men. Alarm rose in her chest. She guessed that they must have been following them from Montana. Honora gripped her friend's arm. Irene lifted her eyes from the book she was reading. "What is it?" she asked when she saw how petrified her friend looked. "My uncle's men," Honora whispered. She turned and tugged on Taylor's shirt. He had been sleeping beside her. "What is it, Honora?" he asked groggily, seeing the anxiety in her eyes. "We have to get off the train and fast," she whispered to him, and pointed in the direction of the men who were looking about the train but hadn't yet seen her. Taylor took their trunk and his bag and slowly rose. Honora and Irene did the same. They had succeeded in leaving the cabin when the train started moving again. She was about to tell them that they ought to go and hide in another cabin far away from the men when she turned and saw them coming after her. Honora panicked and started running. Taylor and Irene ran after her, throwing luggage and belongings of the passengers in the men's way to hinder their pursuit. They caused quite a commotion in the train. Passengers yelled at them. As the train was beginning to gather speed and the men were still closing in on them, Honora ran to the door and shouted, "We have to jump!" Taylor and Irene looked at her with astonishment. "Are you crazy?" they asked in unison. "Watch," Honora simply replied. She would rather be injured trying to escape than taken back to Montana. She didn't want to think what her uncle would do to her if she was returned. Staying on the train would certainly mean that they would be captured by her uncle's men. Taylor couldn't fight them all. Honora, with her pulse racing, jumped from the train, curled into a ball and landed safely on the hard and dusty ground. She had once read how to do it from a book. "Quick!" she shouted as the train increased its speed. Taylor shook his head and threw their trunk and his bag off the train. Then he nudged Irene to jump. The frightened woman did so, screaming. Taylor followed her just as the men drew close to him. By then, the train sped down the rail, making it very dangerous for Honora's uncle's men to jump after them. Taylor ran over to Honora after helping Irene to her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked, looking her all over. She nodded. "I'm sorry. I know I promised not to leave the train before arriving at our destination." He grinned. "I understand that we had to." Taylor pushed a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, and then he cupped her cheek. Later, Honora guessed that he would have kissed her if Irene wasn't there. Given that they couldn't stay there waiting for another train, they decided to walk to the next town. As the trio moved across the dry plains, they reflected on this crazy, unexpected, eventful journey, and they hadn't even made it to California yet. Chapter 14. A sigh of relief left Taylor's lips when he saw the roughly hewn signboard signifying that they were in the next town. They had been walking for well over an hour before they arrived. Honora had apologized repeatedly for making them take such a strenuous journey. Taylor had simply chosen to find the humor in it. "Stop apologizing, Honora," he had said when she apologized again. "Think of this. We'll have a lot of stories to tell our children and grandchildren." Honora's face had turned a rosy hue. Taylor had cursed himself for causing her embarrassment. He had simply wanted her to stop blaming herself. An uneasy silence descended between them after that, until Irene decided to tell them about the book she was reading on the train before their departure. Her story had taken them to the next town. Taylor reckoned that he ought to find an inn where they could find something to eat and drink. Thankfully, they were almost in California. They could either wait for the next train or take a stagecoach all the way to California. With all the incidents they had experienced on trains, he figured taking a stagecoach would be best for them. Taylor sighed when a train pulled up at its station just as they reached the mining town. He saw a stagecoach as well and debated with himself which would be better for them. If the train was going to make a turn and head straight to California, they would have to board it. His decision was made for him when he saw Isabella and her father get down from the conveyance. "Hide!" he whispered fiercely to Honora and Irene, who were both busy idly soaking in their surroundings. Taylor nudged them towards a signboard, and they hid behind it. "Did you see them?" Honora whispered. "How can they be coming from the opposite direction?" Taylor motioned for her to be quiet as Isabella alighted from the train and stood beside the signboard. "Daddy, are you sure he's heading to Montana?" she asked her father. "Yes, darling, that's what his father said." Taylor gritted his teeth. If he had known that his father would divulge this information, he wouldn't have told him, or he would have given him a fake destination. "But this place is filthy. Let's go, Daddy, let's find him, and tell him he must marry me," she whined, as he had come to know her to do. "I don't know what I will do if Taylor doesn't marry me." Taylor felt both women's eyes on him. He groaned inwardly. He had a lot of explaining to do, but for now, they had to leave the station without Isabella and her father seeing him. "Hurry!" he whispered to the women. "Let's take the stagecoach to the next town." Lowering his hat on his head, Taylor motioned for the women to come with him. From the corner of his eye, he observed the man and woman he was running from. They had just climbed into the stagecoach when Isabella looked in their direction. "Taylor!" "Ride as if your life depends on it," Taylor instructed the stagecoach driver. He and the women were thrown back against their seats when the man flipped the horse's reins and the animals surged forward. "Daddy, stop him!" Taylor sighed with relief when they rode past Isabella and her father. He looked back to see Roger still running after them. The man couldn't catch up and had to give up eventually. He turned in his seat to see Honora and Irene staring at him expectantly. He sighed and gathered his words in his mind before he began. Taylor decided to tell them the truth without holding anything back. He began with how his father was a rancher, and he arrived in Carson to work as an engineer. He arrived to build a life for himself. He worked and socialized, but he felt something was missing. He found all of the women uninteresting and couldn't picture wedding any of them. Then he met Roger, and his daughter Isabella proved relentless in her pursuit of him, even using her father. He explained how Roger threatened to destroy his career if he didn't wed Isabella. Trapped, Taylor did the only thing he could think of to escape. "I had no choice, so I placed an ad to escape Isabella. I never planned on having a family, and I value science well over the institution of marriage. I have never bothered myself with such nonsense before," he explained with barely covered disdain. "Nonsense?" Honora gasped. He shrugged. "Yes, I see it as nonsense. Why would anyone think that life was all about getting married and having children? Why would anyone think in such a primitive way as to be content with just working in a mine, being a farmer or doing ranch work, and then they marry, have children and die, and that's all that can be said about them?" Anger flared in Honora's eyes. "Yes, as if you'd know what hard work is? You think just because you are innovative that others have your choices? Hard-working people should be respected, not mocked. That's not... I know exactly what you mean. With your innovation, you think that you're better than everyone else." She stabbed a finger in the air. "If you think carefully about it, you will realize that those people you just mocked, including your father, have in one way or another contributed greatly to your life. So, instead of being a condescending oaf, I think you should be grateful to those people, Sats." Taylor could only stare at Honora. He hadn't expected an innocent conversation to take such a drastic turn. For one, he had never looked down on the people she mentioned. His anger was that they were trying to make him conform to their lifestyle when he had his own future plans. Taylor resolved not to say anything more. He was afraid that he and Honora might end up having a row, and who knew? She might just decide to leave the conveyance while it was still moving. He wouldn't put anything past her anymore. He sighed inwardly and looked out the window at what would definitely be an uncomfortable ride to the next. Chapter 15. Honora couldn't wait for the coach ride to be over. She couldn't believe that he was so condescending. His take on people who worked hard for a living shocked her. She had thought that he was a kind and considerate person. Doubt began to fill her mind. Perhaps she had only seen what she wanted to see in him. Maybe he wasn't really the gentleman she thought he was. Now that they were drawing closer to California, his true colors were beginning to show, and this frightened her. What did she really know about him other than what he told her? What if they were all lies? He hadn't mentioned the women who wanted to marry him at all costs. What if, after playing with that woman's heart and promising her marriage, he was now running from it? Honora felt betrayed and afraid. Give him the benefit of the doubt, Honora. After all, you didn't tell him about your uncle. Honora flushed. Truly, she wasn't in a position to judge him. After all, it was due to her past that they were riding in a stagecoach instead of a train. But that wasn't what caused her to be in a fury. It was the fact that Taylor had looked down on marriage and all that it offered. While she was trying to speak up for women seeing themselves as more than just bargaining tools for marriage, she would never look down on the sacred union that it entailed. Her parents had shown her that if you loved the right person and shared the same ideas, getting married and having children wasn't a bad idea. But was she in love with the right man? She had thought so in the previous town, but now she wasn't so sure. They might share the same ideas of changing the world, but if they couldn't agree about working men and women, then she didn't think that there was any hope for them. Taylor stirred beside her and cleared his throat. "We'll be arriving in Mayhover pretty soon. While I would love for us to head straight to either San Jose or Carson, we can't afford to do that now. That I know that Isabella and her father are on my trail." Taylor paused. "Honora, I'm sorry that it might look as if I'm rushing you, but I beseech you that we have to be wed in the next town. If we have to go to California before getting married, I'm afraid that we might encounter obstacles that we might not be able to surpass." Honora didn't think it was a bad idea if things stopped them from getting married, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and looked away. She was scared that if she opened her mouth, she would burst into uncontrollable tears. Her heart ached from the words that he had said earlier. The silence continued until they reached the next town. Honora wished that she could tell the coachman to ride on when Taylor descended. He had told them to wait while he made inquiries. Irene took her hand and squeezed it tightly. Honora had almost forgotten that her friend was there. So furious and hurt was she that she wished that she could go somewhere to cry her eyes out. "Honora, you're going to be married in a few minutes. You can't afford to be angry with your husband-to-be," Irene said quietly. "It wouldn't bode well for your marriage." Honora sniffed. "Irene, to be truthful, I don't know if it's a good idea to marry him given his views on hard-working men and women." The pressure of Irene's grasp increased. "Talk things over with him. I don't think you read it right, though. Taylor didn't give the impression of a man who would look down on anyone." "I didn't get that from him either, but you heard what he said. He called having a home nonsense." Irene shook her head. "I think it was just his frustration talking. Besides, you love him, so you will be unhappy without him." Honora gasped at her friend's words. Hot pink stained her cheeks. Unable to deny it, she simply said, "Is it that obvious?" Irene smiled softly, only to a discerning eye. A blush crept up her face, deepening her color, meaning he might be aware of it too? Her friend shook her head. "I don't think so. I reckon that he regrets the conversation as well. I don't know much about men, but I think your feelings are reciprocated." Honora scoffed. "You heard the reason he needs a mail-order bride." Irene shrugged. "It might have started out that way, but I don't think so anymore." Before Honora could reply, Taylor came back to the stagecoach. He informed them that it was safe for them to leave the conveyance. Honora sighed, wishing there was a way she could get out of the wedding. She pushed back her tears and ignored his outstretched hand to help her down from the stagecoach. A small sigh left her lips when she saw the size of the town. This was where she would be wed to a man who might fool around with women and promise them the world, only to run away while crushing their hearts in the process. These thoughts of uncertainty roamed in her mind, but what was certain was his warped views on hard-working men and women. Honora almost burst into tears. This was not what she had in mind when she left Montana for a better life. Chapter 16. The trio found the inhabitants welcoming and warm, helping the 3 weary travelers find room and board. Tight-lipped, Taylor went about the town making the marriage preparations for him and Honora. He would need to find a justice to officiate the wedding, and Irene would be their witness. However, he and Honora hadn't even spoken to each other in the 2 hours since they had arrived. This would make for an awkward marriage ceremony. When Taylor inquired about an officiant, the judge smiled at Honora and Taylor. "You two must have taken one look at each other and decided that you wanted to be together," the man said, and laughed heartily. Taylor had smiled and turned to look at Honora. The smile wiped off his face when he saw that hers was devoid of any emotion. He didn't know why she had chosen to ignore him. He was the one offended here. She had accused him of being condescending when he was nothing like that. Unfortunately, he knew that she would never apologize to him for the false accusation. Then why do you still want to marry her? He still needed a wife, spirited or not. Now that Isabella had left Carson in search of him, he had to be wed before he returned there. Time was of the essence. Keep telling yourself that even though you know it isn't the truth. Why else would he be marrying her? He had left California and traveled hundreds of miles to go and fetch her. What else was there? What about the fact that you can't stop thinking about her? And the fact that just the mere sight of her puts a smile on your face? What about your constant yearning to kiss her, hold her hand, and rake your fingers through her hair? Taylor couldn't say anything at that. He couldn't deny the fact that his voice in his head was right. But what did that mean? He had never experienced all that with any other woman. Confusion had him frowning. "You're in love with her." Taylor shook his head, trying to deny what he believed might be true. If he accepted that he was in love with her, it meant that things would change. Taylor let out a deep sigh. He hadn't meant to fall in love with his mail-order bride. He had simply sought someone to keep Isabella from chasing him about. Loving Honora meant that he wouldn't treat her merely like a means to an end anymore. She would become a real wife to him. Taylor knew he ought to feel despair at that because he wouldn't be able to come and go as he pleased. Instead, he felt inexplicable joy. Although he was still angry at Honora, he was glad that she was the one he had fallen in love with. She was everything he wanted in a woman and more. However, he would have to keep his feelings at bay until he could talk to Honora and sort things out with her. With the way she was not only ignoring him, but avoiding him, he would have to work extra hard to make her see that they had only had a misunderstanding. Chapter 17. "Smile, Honora. Today is your wedding day," Irene said to her friend, who looked as if she were at a funeral. "What's there to smile about, Irene? I'm marrying a man who would have looked down on my father had he been alive. A man who is marrying me because he doesn't want to marry another. Tell me, is there anything to be joyous about?" Irene shook her head. "Put that way, it doesn't seem to be anything to be happy about, but I don't think it will remain that way forever." "He hasn't apologized, Irene. The wedding is minutes away, yet he isn't concerned that things aren't fine with us," Honora sniffed. "He's only interested in marrying me to run away from that woman." Irene placed her hand on her friend's shoulder. "I don't think that is it. He has gone out of his way to make today special for you. I mean, just take a look at that dress. If all he wanted was to marry you to escape from that woman, then I think he would have done so immediately when he got permission to wed you. But he has gone about to even arrange a reception. He didn't need to do that, but he did. So don't think badly of him." What if he did it just so that the marriage would look real to Isabella? After all, he's trying to convince her to leave him alone. Irene laughed. "You're bent on painting him in a bad light, aren't you?" Honora turned away and sat on the bed. She would rather have things return to normal between her and Taylor than marry him like this. Irene was right. Taylor had gone the extra mile to make sure their wedding looked like one and not like a rushed event. The beautiful white lace dress with silk trimmings made her feel special. The crown of flowers on her head was made by Irene. Taylor had also sent a pair of ankle boots for her to try on. She had wondered how he was not only able to guess her size, he was also able to get the things at such short notice. She was told by the seamstress that it was sheer luck that she had something in her dressmaker's shop that fit Honora perfectly. Honora had heard that a reception would be held at the town hall after their joining. She had thought it irrelevant, but when she remembered Irene's claim that Taylor was trying to make the day special for her, she decided to go with that. A knock on the door indicated that it was time for her to join Taylor at the church for their union. Honora and Irene left the place and took the small walk around the town to the chapel. The people thronged to the building in their best bib and tucker. Honora learned from their loud whispers that the townsfolk hadn't witnessed a wedding in a long time, so they were quite excited that there would be merrymaking after the event. As they walked through town, she thought she saw out of the corner of her eye a recognizable face mingling with the crowd, but the face disappeared before she could take a better look. Honora shook her head. I am probably imagining things. Honora had mixed feelings as they approached the small church. On one hand, she loved Taylor and wanted nothing more than to marry him, but she was also afraid that she would be unhappy in a union with a man who seemed so opposed to things she cared about. Could they find common ground? Could they get along? Could they get along when he didn't seem to respect her or her upbringing? Her breath caught in her throat when she entered the place. It was packed full of people who turned to cast smiles at her. Honora's steps faltered. I can't do this. I have to go. But the second Honora saw him slowly turning from his place at the altar, everything stopped. Suddenly, she saw the man for who he was, who she fell in love with, and knew they could work out this disagreement. His eyes moved all over her body, causing a blush to rise on her face. She didn't know if she had imagined it, but there was male approval in his eyes, and a smile touched his lips. She loved this man. Even if he didn't love her, she would take it as a challenge to make him do so. There was nothing she set her heart to do that she didn't achieve. Yes, making Taylor fall in love with her would be her next mission. Come what may, he would come to love her. He looked so handsome, garbed in black and white, she almost ran to him. Nevertheless, she controlled her emotions and tried to look bored even though excitement raced through her. She reached Taylor's side in a few steps. He smiled at her and took her hands. They were cold, and it made her wonder if he was already beginning to have cold feet. If he dared to tell her that maybe they ought to wait first before getting married, she would tie him and gag him. She desperately wanted to be his wife because she loved him so much. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here to witness the joining of Taylor and Honora, the preacher began, and snapped her attention from her intended to the short, robust man. Honora held her breath when the preacher reached the part where he had to ask if anyone was against the wedding taking place. She resolved to step on Taylor's foot if he had the mind of telling the man of cloth not to continue with the ceremony. Honora released a slow breath when Taylor didn't say anything and no one else chose to object. They had just turned back to the priest when Honora heard someone run into the church. I forbid it, a woman shrieked. Taylor stiffened beside Honora. Honora, stunned, gathered that the woman would be none other than Isabella. Honora turned her body in the direction of the voice. Her lips parted when she saw the beautiful, tall, and slim Isabella with shiny blonde hair on her head. She looked so prim and proper in a blue satin dress. And you think he's better off with you? Young woman, why do you think that this man and woman shouldn't be wed? The preacher asked. Taylor hadn't bothered to turn around. His tightened face held anger and exasperation. He's supposed to marry me, Isabella hissed, with her hands on her hips. The crowd erupted in a murmur throughout the church. The preacher, stunned, returned his gaze to Taylor. Did you promise yourself to this woman? Taylor shook his head. There's only one woman I have ever promised marriage to, and that woman is standing beside me right now." Touched by his words, Honora focused her gaze on his hardened face. "No!" Isabella cried, dropping her hands and stamping a booted foot on the ground. "You can't do this to me, Taylor. We're meant to be together." Taylor's lips narrowed into a thin line. "Reverend, could you please proceed with the wedding?" Taylor wasn't sure what to do besides continue the ceremony. Isabella, flustered at his reaction, suddenly threw her hand to her forehead. "I don't feel well!" Isabella shrieked, shifting Honora's gaze from Taylor to Isabella. Isabella staggered backwards, her balance unsteady. Honora stood resolute, even held back a bemused grin. Would Isabella stop at nothing to get his attention? At that, two men sprang from their seats and caught the fainting Isabella before she reached the ground. Otherwise, she would have cracked her skull on the bare floor. "Reverend, please continue," Taylor said firmly. The preacher, who was stretching on tiptoes to see what was going on with Isabella, reddened and cleared his throat. "I now pronounce you." "I feel better now," Isabella shouted from her position on the ground and pushed herself up. "But Pastor, you should hurry. My neighbor is very sick. She needs someone to pray for her." "I'll be with you shortly, ma'am," the preacher said, and went on with the marriage ceremony. "I now pronounce." "Oh, I don't feel well at all," Isabella said, placing a hand on her forehead again. Honora was grateful that the men were still on hand to catch Isabella when she pretended to swoon again. Honora didn't know whether to be angry with the woman for trying to spoil her wedding or to feel sorry for her for losing out on marrying Taylor. "I now pronounce you man and wife." Cheers erupted all around. Taylor turned to look at her. He smiled brightly at her. Honora was cautious with hers. Taylor had gotten what he wanted despite Isabella's efforts to ruin their wedding. Even a simple wedding ended up being dramatic. "With you, there's no dull moment," he said to her, amidst the raucous cheers in the church. At that, Taylor embraced his new wife and kissed her. Chapter 18. Isabella continued to wail on the floor, even when her father tried to gather her up. Honora watched the scene unfold and felt even a little pity for poor Isabella. Her attempt to thwart the marriage had failed, and now she sat, inconsolable on the floor, doing nothing more than embarrassing herself. Honora's smile never wavered as she accepted the congratulatory messages of the people whom she hadn't even known hours earlier. Everyone kept complimenting her on her beautiful dress. Observing Taylor, Honora couldn't believe that she was now his wife. If she had been told when they were jumping off the train earlier in the day that she would be wed to him that same day, she wouldn't have believed it. They still had to talk about the argument they had in the stagecoach and also that they weren't really speaking to each other. But at the moment, watching how handsome he looked, an inch taller than most of the people surrounding them, Honora's heart swelled with love for him. As the townsfolk followed them out of the church to the town hall, Honora realized that they had just made lifelong friendships there. Whenever they went on a trip, they would always have to make a stop at Mayhover to exchange pleasantries with the townspeople. The musicians with their fiddle, fife, drum, and violin were already ready by the time they reached the red brick building that served as the town hall. Honora took her place beside Taylor at the table that had been raised on a dais at the end of the hall. She was amazed to see long tables laden with food and drinks. A huge punch bowl stood separately at one side of the room. "Would you like me to fetch you something to eat and drink?" Taylor said beside her. She turned in her chair to fix surprised eyes on him. A pang hit her heart when she saw that he was smiling. "I thought you'd lost your tongue these past hours," she threw at him and changed the direction of her gaze. Joy whirled inside her that he was now talking to her, but he didn't have to know that. Taylor guffawed. "You couldn't have just let it go?" She shook her head. "Not when you gave me cause for concern with how you view people you deem lower than you." Taylor sighed. "You misunderstood me, Honora. However, I do not wish to argue with you. This is our wedding day. Do you think we can call a truce so that we can enjoy it? Possibly we could discuss it later." Honora wanted nothing more, but she tilted her head to the side as if she was thinking about it. Then she shrugged as if she didn't care one way or the other. She ignored Taylor's chuckle and nodded. He excused himself to go and get her something to eat and drink. Honora burst into a fit of laughter when she saw Isabella heading straight for Taylor immediately as she entered the place. Her gaze moved to the woman's father, who was staring appreciatively at a group of women. Honora was stunned when the man simply walked to one of the tables packed with food and took a plate. He began placing pieces of chicken on the plate. A woman showed up by his side to help him with the other meals. He walked away with the woman, and they began conversing at one side of the hall. The man appeared to be enjoying himself, forgetting what brought him to Mayhover in the first place. His daughter was relentless in her pursuit of Taylor, who was bringing over 2 plates of food on a tray. From the energetic way she was talking, gesticulating with her hands, Honora surmised that she was quite furious, and her father was completely ignoring her. When she walked over to him to try to seek his assistance, he brushed her away, his attention locked on the woman who was smiling brightly at him. Realizing that she had failed in her mission, Isabella found a chair in a corner and dropped heavily on it. Her hands went to her face as her body shook with sobs. Honora's heart went out to her. Taylor came back with their food before Honora could rise to go and comfort the miserable woman. Before they could settle down to eat, Honora and Taylor were called to dance. Taylor grimaced and Honora laughed. Shrugging, he took her hand and helped her to her feet. Honora held herself stiffly in Taylor's arms, although she was happy to dance with him again. Taylor's easy charm got to her, and she let go of her animosity and had a great time with him. Irene and another man danced beside them, and soon the floor was filled with people. The dance went on, and Taylor and Honora returned to their seats to eat and drink. Honora watched with pity as Isabella, in her despondent state, drank 1 glass of rye whiskey after another. She kept on tossing her head back and throwing the liquid down her throat. Unable to continue looking at her without doing something about it, Honora rose from the table. She walked to where the woman lay slumped on the ground against the wall. "I reckon that you're here to make a jest of me." Isabella's words were slurred. Honora shook her head at the pitiful state of the woman. "You've won." "Isabella, you're a very beautiful woman. Why would you stoop so low as to go about chasing a man who doesn't want you?" Honora softly queried. For an answer, Isabella burst into tears. Honora felt so sorry for the young woman that, not minding her dress, she sat on the floor beside her. Putting her arm around Isabella, she said, There now, everything will be fine." Isabella lifted her tear-stained face. "It never will. Papa will continue to expect the best from me." Honora's forehead scrunched into a frown. Her eyes searched the crowd for the man in question. He was having a hearty conversation with the woman he had been with all day. Isabella hiccuped. "You see, Papa raised me to be perfect, and so I must live my life in a perfect way, particularly as he doesn't have a son to inherit his empire. Therefore, it's on my shoulders to marry a decent man who would help run Papa's business upon his demise." Pity coursed through Honora's body for the burden the poor woman had to carry. "I was in love with our stable hand, but Papa would hear nothing of it. He made the man leave, stating that I couldn't marry beneath my status." Isabella gripped her hand tightly. "I'm so sorry for trying to ruin your wedding." "It doesn't matter. I forgive you," she replied, and smiled at the teary-eyed woman. As always, she felt Taylor's presence before she saw him. He looked from her to the drunken Isabella with surprised eyes. "Congratulations, Taylor," Isabella said and sniffed. "I wish both of you a happy life." She hiccuped and fell straight into a drunken slumber in Honora's arms. "I'll get her father," Taylor softly said, and turned to walk away. He halted his steps and said, "Thank you." Heat infused Honora's face due to the delight that ran through her at Taylor's words. Chapter 19. Taylor watched with pride as his wife helped carry water to the workers. With each passing day that they stayed back in the town as man and wife, he was falling more and more in love with her. When he suggested that they ought to leave the town the morning after their wedding, Honora had pleaded for him to stay back and help the townsfolk. "I was told that a construction project was going on. They could really use an extra hand to finish it quickly," she had told him, as he escorted her back to the inn after their wedding party. "Honora, we have to continue to California. You know we've wasted a lot of time during the trip," he had pointed out, and she had blushed. "I understand. I'm just saying that the people have been so helpful and welcoming. It's the least we can do to help them," she had quietly argued. He had agreed to stay since he had made it his life's mission to make her happy. Whatever he could do to put a smile on her face was something he would always try to achieve. "Thank you, Taylor," one of the men said as Taylor carried some planks to where they would be hammered to continue the house construction. "You're welcome, James," Taylor replied with a smile. He walked back to carry some more planks when a shadow shielded him from the rays of the sun. Instantly, he knew it was Honora. His beautiful wife always smelled of flowers. He straightened and regarded her with a smile on his face. "I thought you might like a break. The women and I, made some apple pies and sweet tea," she said, and tilted her head towards a tree where she had placed her offerings. He smiled and told the men that he would be back. They exchanged knowing smiles among themselves. Taylor grinned. He knew what they were thinking, and he couldn't blame them. Anyone would want to spend some time with his wife, especially if he loved her. Taylor went with Honora to the tree that was a few paces from the construction site. He settled down against the huge tree and partook of Honora's offerings. They ate in companionable silence for a while, simply basking in each other's company. "I don't want to spoil your mood, Honora. I know you and Irene are having a good time here, but we have to leave Mayhover soon. We've been here for 3 days. We can't stay here forever." Honora sighed. "I know. We've been blessed to be among such people, but I acknowledge that it's time to leave." He smiled at her. "Besides, I don't think we should endanger the townsfolk. I don't think my uncle has relented in trying to find me. I reckon that they've lost us, but they might be able to find us any time." He nodded. "He can't do anything anymore now that we're married, but to be on the safe side, we'd best be in California before he comes bearing down his wrath." "I agree with you," she replied, sipping her drink. A cloak of silence fell between them. Honora's gaze was welded to the workers while his was on her. She was looking particularly fetching in a green print dress that complemented her hair. "Have I told you how beautiful you look today?" he questioned gently. Her face reddened and she shook her head. "You're a very beautiful and intelligent woman. I'm thankful that you're mine," he said, and took her hand to place a kiss on it. She blushed fierily and looked away. Reluctantly, he rose to join the men who were still hard at work. He wished he could declare his feelings for her, but he thought to himself that it was neither the time nor the place. There would be ample time to do that when they were alone in his house in Carson. He looked forward to them arriving so that they could furnish the house together. He had wanted to do it all by himself, but loving Honora, he wanted her to be a part of it too. A fond smile curled his lips when he remembered how it used to be between his mother and his father before the former's demise. He had thought that he would never have such, but it looked possible now, and he was happy. His eyes followed her as she took the small basket back to where the women were gathered. He would cherish her for as long as he lived. Chapter 20. Just as she was settling into comfort, Honora reflected on her uncle. Honora had thought that maybe her uncle had given up on chasing her, and that they would have a smooth journey back to California. She should have known better than to think her uncle would not be tenacious in his pursuit. They had hardly arrived at the stagecoach station in Mayhover when they saw the men alighting from the train. Taylor had planned that they would take a stagecoach straight to Carson, but when they saw the men coming after them, they abandoned the plan and headed for the train in the opposite direction. They boarded the train just before it began its journey. They saw the men running to catch up with the conveyance, but it was futile. Honora had thought it was over, and she relaxed and enjoyed the train ride to California with her husband and her friend. It still sounded strange calling Taylor her husband. She had to admit that ever since they had exchanged vows, he had become more caring and attentive towards her. Irene had noticed it and mentioned it too. "So I think you're going to have a blissful marriage with him," Irene had concluded. Honora had remarked, "That's left to be seen. It might be totally different when we get to California. I don't want to raise my hopes and dream of a happily ever after that might not take place." Inwardly, she hoped that she would enjoy being married to Taylor. Possibly with time, he would come to love her. Honora had just forced her gaze from his when she looked out the window and gasped. Her worst fear was materializing before her very eyes. Her uncle's men were trying to catch up with the train on horses that were quite fast. She leaned forward and shook her husband's hand. She pointed at the window. "Look!" Taylor and Irene looked out of the window and saw the cloud of dust gathering. Taylor gritted his teeth. "Land sakes, those men are like dogs with a bone," he grimaced and rose. He shrugged and said, "Well, we know what to do." Irene let out a heavy sigh. "Just when I wanted to catch a nap." Honora giggled. "I'm sorry, Irene." Her friend offered her a small smile. "Don't apologize at all, Honora. I'm already fixing to write a book about our exploits." Her friend joined her husband by the door. As usual, their fellow passengers stared at them, wondering what they were going to do. Thankfully, they would soon be stopping in the next county, so the train began to slow down. They didn't wait for it to draw to a complete stop before Taylor and Honora threw themselves out of it with their trunk and bag. Honora kept rolling until something stopped her. She found herself on Taylor, who was equally winded. Both of them, breathing heavily, stared at each other. Taylor raised his hands and cupped her face. Honora's lips parted as her heart raced in her chest. Her mouth ran dry when he began caressing her cheeks, and she lowered her head. Honora closed her eyes, already anticipating his kiss and knowing that it would blow her away. Unfortunately, Irene chose that moment to bump into them after rolling down the hill, screaming. They all burst into laughter. Minutes later, they were up and continued their journey to California. Thankfully, the men didn't see them when they jumped down from the train, so they continued chasing it. The trio walked to the next town and encountered the men again. Gunfire sounded in the air to stop them from running to catch a stagecoach, but the three of them weren't deterred in their race. "How wrong it is for women to wear dresses and multiple petticoats in times like this. How inconvenient," Irene complained as she ran and threw herself into a stagecoach. Honora laughed behind her and Taylor helped her to reach the moving conveyance. Taylor joined her a few minutes later. They ignored the shocked passengers who were gawking at them, and then they burst into laughter. "I'm going to write about the disservice such clothes are to women in such situations," Irene pressed as they continued their journey. "Would you prefer to wear trousers and breeches?" Taylor asked with amusement in his eyes. "Most certainly," Irene replied as she removed her bonnet to move it back and forth across her face. Honora giggled. Taylor turned to her. "What about you, Honora? Would you prefer to be garbed in men's clothing?" She nodded enthusiastically, and they laughed again. "I reckon that you would have discovered that Irene and I are better runners than you." Laughter rumbled from Taylor's chest. The sound made Honora happy. Unconsciously, she leaned closer to him on the floor of the conveyance. "Well, when we get to Carson, I'll take both of you up on the offer, and then we'll have a race to silence both of you once and for all." The topic made for an animated debate among them throughout the journey to the next town. Some of the passengers contributed to it. By the time they got down, Honora reckoned that the men and women would think them a strange bunch indeed. Chapter 21. "Hold it right there. Where do you think you're going?" Taylor's smile wiped off his face when they reached the entrance to the town and saw two men pointing their guns at them. For a moment, he wondered if they were part of Honora's uncle's men. He quickly looked in her direction, but there was no sense of recognition in her features. He stood in front of the women and said, "We're travelers. We're on our way to Carson. We missed the train." The stony expressions on the faces of the men didn't change. "So," one of them asked. "We wish to spend a night or more in your town, pending the arrival of the next train," Taylor explained, looking from one man to the other. The man snapped, "We don't accept outsiders. Be on your way." Taylor raised his hand in supplication to the man. Dusk was almost falling. They couldn't walk to the next town in darkness. "We'll be off in the morning. We just need a place to spend the night. It doesn't matter if it's a livery. It's too late in the day to make the journey to the next town." The men cocked their guns when he took a step forward. "Looks like you are hard of hearing. We don't entertain visitors in our town. We don't want no trouble. So get you and your women out of here." Taylor sighed. His funds were speedily dwindling, but if it was the only way for the men to let them stay in the town, then he didn't have a choice. He brought out some notes and stretched them out to the men. "Like I said, it will only be for a night." The men looked at each other and drew closer. Taylor sighed, thinking they had changed their mind and would collect his money to let them in. His eyes widened when the men pointed their guns directly at his forehead. Honora stepped away from behind him, and Taylor gnashed his teeth. "Please don't hurt him," she pleaded. "We'll leave." She tugged at his arm. Taylor wished there was something he could do, but as the women were involved, he decided to let things be. He dropped his outstretched hand, and the man moved away, still pointing the guns at him. "What a welcoming lot," he murmured as he turned on his heels. "The total opposite of Mayhover," Irene stated with a resigned sigh. "You can say that again," Honora said in a wistful tone. Taylor looked in the direction of the woods that surrounded the town. "We can't go to the next town tonight. It's going to be dark pretty soon." Then, with a rueful tone, he said, "I'm sorry, but we'll have to spend the night in the bushes." Both women shrugged. Honora said, "It can't be helped. Besides, it's just for one night." "I know, but I wish it were not so. You both deserve a roof over your heads and hot food in your bellies," he remarked with a tinge of sadness. "We've had all that since the journey began. It's time to experience something else," she pointed out with optimism. Taylor recognized that she was trying to cheer him up and make the best of their dire situation. In that moment, his heart swelled with even more love for this brave woman. He wished they were alone so that he could take her in his arms and kiss her, the way he had been yearning to. Irene let out an amused sigh. "My book was just begging for this." They talked lightheartedly on their way to the bushes. Taylor tried his best to use sticks to make a clearing where they could settle for the night. Honora and Irene picked sticks to make a fire. Taylor gladly made it, and they sat beside it, eating their cold meal of meat, bread, and butter and cheese they were given in Mayhover. Taylor was grateful that they at least had something to eat. The sound of insects and night animals sounded in the clearing when it became dark. "Bears better keep away," Honora said with a tremor. Taylor chuckled. "I promise to keep you safe," he solemnly declared. "I know," Honora concurred with a smile, "which is why I'll sleep soundly." Her lightly spoken words brought joy to his heart. That his wife accepted that he would protect her, come what may, made his chest swell with pride. If he had to fight a lion to keep her safe, Taylor swore that he would do it. The women spread their clothes on the ground to make beddings before settling on it. Taylor didn't close an eyelid that night. He held on securely to his gun, not only for fear of wild animals, but Honora's uncle's men and the uninviting townsfolk too. When he got tired of pacing, he positioned himself on the ground beside his wife. His fond gaze raked her face, illuminated by the firelight. The firm contours of her face had softened in sleep. If he didn't think that it would startle her and disturb her, he would have caressed her cheek lightly. As if she was aware of his eyes on her, she stirred in her sleep and her eyes fluttered open. She smiled. "You should sleep," she sleepily told him. "Wild animals won't come this way." "Don't worry. I'll stay awake to keep them away," he remarked with a smile. She yawned and said, "One thing is certain. A moment with you is never dull." They both laughed just as her eyes closed again. The soft purr from her lips indicated that she had fallen back into sleep. Taylor regarded her face with a fond smile. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. For the umpteenth time, he was grateful that he had married her. He recognized that by marrying Honora, he had given up on the opportunity of a comfortable life with Isabella by inheriting her father's business. But with his marriage to Honora, he had gained everything and more. Smiling, he leaned forward to touch her soft face and place a kiss on her cheek. Chapter 22. "We'll be in the next town in about an hour," Taylor said the following morning as they continued their journey. Honora smiled. She'd felt safe sleeping, knowing that he was watching over her. Rested from the night before, though a bit sore, she carried on with high spirits. She had woken up to find him nodding off against a tree. A smile had crossed her face as she rose from the ground and went to him. His eyes had fluttered open when she reached him. He had smiled brightly at her before yawning. "Did you sleep well?" he had asked as he pushed himself to his feet. "Yes, I did. Knowing you were staying awake to watch over me," she had replied quietly. He had taken her hand. "I'm sorry I dozed off." She had allowed him to draw her closer under the tree. "I'm glad that you did. We have a long way ahead of us unless the train shows up. But with the coldness of that town, I don't think one would stop around here." He had chuckled and enclosed her in his arms. A shiver had run through her body as she thought that at last they would share a kiss. Just when she thought that his head would descend and his lips would capture hers, his gaze had shifted from her face to somewhere behind her. Reluctantly, he had dropped his hands and stepped back. When she turned around, it was to see Irene rousing from her position on the ground. Honora remembered the knowing look that her friend had given her with a smile. Honora was glad that their journey would soon come to an end so that she and Taylor could be together. Honora heard the sound of an approaching coach and her heart lifted. She hoped it would have room for the three of them. Irene heard it too and stopped walking. "The adventure never stops," Irene said and giggled. Taylor strode to the roadside and waved his hand for the stagecoach to stop. Honora and Irene walked to join him. However, a minute later, as the coach drew closer and Honora saw the man whose head popped out of the window, her jaw dropped. "Run!" she screamed. "It's my uncle!" She whirled around to run down the hill to the bushes. Taylor and Irene ran with her. Gunshots sounded in the air, but it didn't stop Honora. With her heart beating a rapid thud against her chest, Honora lifted her skirts and continued running down the stony path. She kicked a stone and stumbled. Taylor held her before she could fall to the ground. Unfortunately, that gave her uncle's men the opportunity to reach them. A tumble ensued among them, and they rolled down the hill. Honora tried to fight off her attacker, but he was too strong for her. She screamed, kicked, and tried to bite him, but it was all for naught. The bulky man held on to her. He dragged her back up the hill to where her uncle was waiting by the road with the stagecoach. He gave her his evil smile. Honora spat on the ground when they reached him. It was very unladylike of her, but she wasn't feeling gracious at the moment. "Honora, you've put me through a lot of trouble trying to find you," the man said as he rubbed his beard. "Then you shouldn't have bothered!" She threw at him with a savage bite. He laughed and said, "Oh, but I had to. I have found the sort of man who would be to your liking. You didn't have to become a mail-order bride just because you were desperate for marriage." Honora's forehead scrunched in a frown. "How did you find out about that?" Her face dropped when she realized that the only person who could have told him was Kate. Knowing that her sister wouldn't voluntarily divulge such sensitive information to him, Honora suspected that her uncle had threatened her. "What did you do to Kate?" she snarled. The man's malicious smile widened. "Nothing. She was only worried about her older sister." Tears smarted in Honora's eyes. She'd written to her sister, telling her of everything that was going on with them. And now she must have told him all that she had written to her. "You're despicable," she shouted at him, surging forward to scratch his eyes out if she could. "Thank you," her uncle said with laughter. His face turned to a cold mask. He turned his gaze to his man and nodded to the coach. "Get her in there. Leave the others." Honora struggled to be set free, but then she was gagged because she kept shouting at her uncle. She was thrown on the ground floor of the coach, and then it took off. Honora fought all the way to the next town, but it was of no use. Worry for her husband and her friend kept her heart beating. She was hauled out of the stagecoach to an inn. Her uncle forced her into movement until they got to the room, and he pushed her in. Honora eyed the man standing by the window warily. Her gag was yanked from her mouth. "This is my lawyer. With him is a document stating that you want your marriage annulled. Sign it and let's go back to Montana. I don't like being away from my business, but as my men kept losing you, I had to come and do the job myself. I can't tell you how much I've spent to get here post-haste." Honora tilted her chin at him. "I will do no such thing." Her uncle's face darkened. "Yes, you will." He nodded at the man who came forward and gave him the document and a pen. He dragged her to the table, slammed the paper on it, and barked. "Sign it." Honora shook her head. "I will not sign it. I'm Mrs. Honora Brooks now, and there's nothing that you can do about it. I will never sign it no matter what you threaten me with." Her uncle's eyes narrowed with anger. A shiver of fear went through Honora, but she stood her ground. She wouldn't allow him to push her around again. A knock sounded on the door, and everyone in the room tensed. Chapter 23. Taylor's pulse raced after the sheriff knocked on the door. Although he wanted Honora's uncle and his men captured, he didn't want anything to happen to his wife. It was sheer luck that while he and Irene ran away from Honora's uncle's men, they had run into the next town's sheriff and 2 of his deputies. The lawmen had been coming from a stagecoach stop where they had gone to take care of a disturbance. The lawmen had arrested the outlaws and taken them to their station. After much interrogation, the men had confessed to doing dirty jobs for Honora's uncle. One of the men, who was afraid to go to jail for a long time, had confessed to Mervyn putting them up, to killing Honora's father and brother a year ago. Taylor had been torn hearing that the man had caused Honora and her sister so much misery. He would have to find a way to pass on the ugly news to her. From asking just a few questions in town, they had known where to find Mervyn and the rest of his men. Now, Taylor feared for Honora's safety. He had been able to keep Irene safe. She was presently in the sheriff's office waiting for them. His gaze fell on the sheriff and his men, who had their black-eyed Susans raised, waiting for the door to open. He had repeatedly begged the sheriff not to go in guns blazing, so that his wife wouldn't be hurt. The man had told him not to tell him how to do his job. He was appointed sheriff 15 years ago and had never failed to catch an outlaw and kept the townsfolk safe. Taylor hadn't been placated by the man's words. Fear for his wife's safety sent beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. The sheriff had told him not to come along, but he wouldn't hear of it. It was his duty and responsibility. He had sworn to protect her, and that was what he would do, even at the cost of his life. He loved Honora in a way that he had never thought that it was possible to love anyone. The door opened a crack, and all hell seemed to break loose at that moment. The outlaw tried to shoot the sheriff, but was instead shot in the arm. And then it was shooting all around. Unable to bear the thought of Honora getting injured, Taylor ran out of the inn and rushed around the building where Honora and her uncle were. Not even thinking about it, he jumped through the window, crashing into a man who was standing by it. The sheriff and Mervyn's men were still exchanging gunfire. Taylor saw Honora huddled in one corner and he ran to her. Fortunately, 2 of the deputies had run after him. With their guns aimed at Mervyn, they told his men to surrender. Grimacing, Mervyn's men dropped their guns and put up their hands. Taylor rushed to his wife and drew her into his arms. She sobbed hysterically. Not minding that there were people there, he caressed her face. "I love you. I love you with every fiber of my being," he announced, stroking her hair. "I love you too," she replied in between tears, completely stunning him. "You do?" he asked with awe. She nodded and smiled through her tears. "Yes." "Even though I'm a condescending oaf?" She laughed heartily. "I love you, flaws and all." Her uncle cursed them as he was arrested, though Honora and Taylor didn't even notice. They couldn't avert their eyes from each other as they held each other's gaze and bodies in a warm embrace. The man would get what he deserved. Loving Honora and being loved in return was all Taylor needed. Chapter 24. 6 months later, Carson, California. "That's amazing." Honora joined the crowd in clapping as the tower lit up in the moonless night. Taylor's hard work hadn't been in vain. The tower had finally been launched despite all the obstacles that had come his way in achieving it. The townsfolk continued to clap for a long time before they came forward to shake hands with Taylor. Honora couldn't have been prouder of her husband than at that moment, watching him smiling at the people as he tried to explain to them in simple terms how the Moonlight Tower came to be. "See? I told you that you'd be happy being married to Taylor," Irene said as she came to stand beside her at the foot of the tower. Honora laughed and nodded. Yes, she was very happy as Taylor's wife. When they finally arrived in California and settled down in Carson, they had talked about their argument in the stagecoach, and she realized that she had misjudged him. Taylor, although he didn't think he would ever be a rancher, had never looked down on the men. He only believed that he could achieve more, and if given the opportunity, anyone could achieve what they wanted to. They had apologized to each other, and things had returned to normal for them. The women of Carson had initially been jealous of her for getting the man they wanted. Eventually, they all became friends. Irene had found herself a loving factory worker who was not only hard-working but shared her progressive views. They were married 2 months later, and Irene was very happy with him. Kate had written to apologize to her about telling their uncle about her destination. It had only been out of concern and love. Kate had never intended to betray her sister. Honora, understanding this, had forgiven her and told her she was welcome to visit any time. Then Honora received news that Kate's husband had died unexpectedly in a mining accident. Kate had used that as an opportunity to leave Montana for California. Both of them had cried in each other's arms when Honora told her about what their uncle did to their father and their brother simply because he wanted to claim their money. Thankfully, the men were now in jail, never to cause anyone misery again. Kate had always had an interest in sewing. So, with the help of Taylor, she was able to set up a dressmaker's shop in Carson. Honora had heard news of one of the townsfolk paying her sister visits in her shop. She wouldn't be surprised if Kate announced that she would soon be married again. Honora, forcing her gaze from her husband, turned to her friend with a grin on her face. "You said so, truly. And yes, I'm very happy being Taylor's wife. I couldn't have asked for a better man," she replied, and shifted her gaze to the man who was walking towards her with determined strides. Irene moved away to join her husband, just as Taylor reached her. Taylor took her in his arms. "Have I told you how fortunate I am to have you in my life?" he whispered into her ears. Her laughter rang out in the noise around them. No one would be able to say that she wasn't a happy woman. She nodded. "Yes, nearly every time you look at me. I'm the happiest woman in the world to be married to such a brilliant and loving man like you." Taylor lowered his head and captured her lips in a sweet kiss. Honora sighed with contentment when he finally pulled away. Now that he had finally achieved his dream of lighting the tower, it was time to tell him that in about 8 months he would acquire another dream come true. Epilogue. 4 years later. "Mama," Ruth called as she ran to the kitchen where her mother was preparing dinner. "Look!" Honora wiped her hands on her apron and turned away from the wooden stove to pay attention to her 3-year-old daughter. Ruth was an exact replica of her mother, but in terms of character, she was the perfect combination of both her and Taylor. Their daughter was a spirited and intelligent child. Honora looked closely at what her daughter was holding protectively in her hands. It was a bird that appeared to be injured. Honora wasn't surprised. Her daughter was always finding injured animals that she took care of until they were well enough to return to the wild. "Poor thing. It has hurt its leg. We'll take care of it until it is well again," she told her daughter. Ruth nodded and began talking to the bird in soft tones. Taylor came into the kitchen just then and smiled. "Papa!" Ruth called, and rushed to throw her arms around him with the bird in her hands. Honora came forward and hugged her husband. They exchanged knowing smiles when their daughter lifted the bird for her father to see. Taylor, who was now working full-time in San Jose to light up other places in the city, sat at the dining table to examine the bird. Ruth didn't leave the kitchen until she was certain that the bird would be all right. She took a piece of bread to feed the poor thing with. "I wonder if this one will be like her," Taylor said, as his hands went around his wife's protruding stomach. Honora turned in his arms and laughed. "I hope so." She wouldn't mind having children who weren't shy in defending the weak. She would also love them to work in the school she had established in Carson to help children of poor parents to read and write. Kate and Irene were active helpers in the school. She went on to tell him of how she went to the house of one of their neighbors who refused to allow his daughter to come to school simply because she was a girl. The man had thought nothing would come out of educating her. When I finished talking to him, he burst into tears and told us to take his daughter and make him proud of her, Honora told her husband matter-of-factly. Taylor smiled. Even after 4 years of marriage, there's still never a dull moment with you. She laughed and kissed him. And we have many more years ahead. Rita mail-order bride to heal his heart now.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the next book in the series. Share this video with your friend or watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.